Naruto's body ached with every breath, which felt like it was a struggle with the world itself. His eyes fought to open due to exhaustion and pain. He could barely focus on the forest in which he lay. He had been ambushed and left rotting. At that very moment, he couldn't be bothered to care any more about the mission that had brought him here. The rogue shinobi had taken its sweet time with him. Each blow, each hurtful word, each wound was like a relentless reminder of all he had experienced in this god-forsaken place. The villagers loathed him, feared him. They saw him as a monster. No matter how hard he tried to prove himself, no matter how much he sacrificed, it was never enough. He had been cast aside from the moment of his birth, a living weapon whose true identity was hidden from the world, all because of a demon sealed within him. Naruto had always dreamed of being accepted, being acknowledged for who he was and not the burden he carried. But that was nothing more than a fleeting fantasy now, lost somewhere in the fog of his memories. The deep, raw wounds on his body mirrored those in his soul. His legs began to tremble and his body wouldn't move any further. He slumped against a tree, his blood soaking into the dirt beneath him. He let his eyes close. For the first time in years, Naruto welcomed the darkness, the quiet emptiness. He let go, drifting into unconsciousness. But even in death, there was no peace. Naruto awoke to an unnatural stillness, a coldness that sank deep into his bones. It was as if the very air around him was filled with sorrow and despair. His eyes slowly opened. The view before him was unlike anything he had ever seen, a barren, fog-shrouded expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no sky, no sun, no stars, just an oppressive grayness that weighed upon him. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, as if a thick mist had settled upon it. And then he heard it, the soft, echoing footsteps. The sound seemed to come from all around him, as if the very air was alive with the presence of something ancient. Naruto turned, his instincts telling him something was wrong. But when he saw the figure emerging from the mist, he froze. A towering presence, cloaked in dark robes, its face obscured by a hollow mask. The air around the figure crackled with an overwhelming power, an aura that made Naruto's heart race in his chest. It was something beyond human, something incomprehensible, ancient, and utterly terrifying. The figure's glowing eyes pierced through the fog, and it spoke, its voice booming in Naruto's mind. "I am the Shinigami," it said, its tone both commanding and indifferent, "the god of death, the keeper of souls. You have died, child." Naruto stumbled back, confusion and fear overtaking him. What? What do you mean I'm dead? I can't be dead. I. The Shinigami's gaze softened, though only slightly. You have been given a second chance, a chance to live. But it comes with a price. In his mind, Naruto was racing. He had almost died once, he had felt the pain of drifting away, but in this strange place, he couldn't help but feel a little peace. The pain was gone, and the weight of the years, the solitude, the hatred, it all seemed so far away now. Why? He whispered, his voice trembling. Why me? Why offer me this chance? The eyes of the Shinigami flickered with an ancient sorrow. For I see your suffering. Your soul is tainted with rage, loneliness, and despair. You have been cast aside by your world, and now, your fate has led you here. But I am willing to offer you power. Power to shape your destiny, power to reshape your world. Naruto's pulse quickened. Power? He asked, voice almost a whisper. He had never been offered such a thing. He had always been powerless, a pawn in the eyes of others. But now, in this strange realm, he felt the gravity of the Shinigami's words, the weight of an offer he couldn't ignore. You will be my vessel, the Shinigami continued, its voice almost echoing in Naruto's mind. You will carry out my will in the mortal realm. In return, I will grant you the strength to destroy those who have wronged you, the strength to become the god you have always sought to be. Naruto's breath caught in his throat. Destroy them? Was this truly the power he had longed for, the power to take control of his life? To take control of his own fate? A fire began to stir deep within him, something that had been smoldering for years. Anger. Pain. Hatred. It surged through him like a tidal wave, and for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. I accept, Naruto said, his voice filled with newfound determination. I'll do it. I'll carry out your will. Just let me live. Let me make them all pay. The Shinigami's gaze seemed to pierce into his very soul. Very well, it intoned. You will live, Naruto Uzumaki. And you will be my agent, my instrument of vengeance. But remember, child, with great power comes great responsibility. Do not let your darkness consume you, for it will be your undoing. Naruto nodded, his mind full of the promise of revenge, of power, and of finally being able to prove himself. He didn't care what the cost was. He didn't care about the consequences. All he wanted was to make those who tormented him pay. Then it happened. Shinigami raised its hand, and in an instant everything around Naruto moved. Pain felt like the redrawing of everything within his bones, the same feel as the ripping of a heart. On Naruto's arms and back grew dark twisted marks, signifying the seals connected to Shinigami. Fire burned bright beneath his lids but appeared slightly dim from its spectral quality because of what occurred with him. And then, just like that, the pain was gone. Naruto's mind expanded, and he was standing on his own 2 feet now, feeling no oppressive weight of his wounds at all. The voice of the Shinigami rang once more inside Naruto's head. Go now, it ordered. Your world awaits. Before he could say anything, the world around him went to mist again. Naruto gasped as he opened his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He was no longer in the cold, desolate realm. The familiar sights of the forest greeted him, though everything felt different now. The pain in his body was gone, and the exhaustion that had once threatened to drag him back into unconsciousness had disappeared. He glanced down, wanting to see his hands. There were dark black seals all along his arms that seemed to spread, in veins, under his skin. They looked alien, yet pulsed with some kind of life he couldn't even begin to comprehend, an energy, perhaps, that felt infinite. He could feel it, the power moving within him. It was crushing, like an unrelenting tide, yet he could check its movement. His body thrummed with energy, and for the first time in his life, Naruto felt unstoppable. He slowly stood up, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. His mind was racing with thoughts of vengeance, of all those who had wronged him, of the villagers who had cast him aside, of the Hokage who had never truly seen him. His eyes, glowing faintly with spectral light, scanned the forest around him. Everything seemed different now. He was not just Naruto Uzumaki, the orphan outcast. No. He was something else now. Something more. Takes a deep breath and heads out of the forest, unknowing of all the changes taking place inside him. He was not just a little boy abandoned by the world, he was something much more, something that would redefine everything. And the world? The world was soon to learn who he really was. As Naruto stepped into the unknown, his future spread out before him like an open road, dark and endless. And with every step, he could feel the weight of his pact with the Shinigami sinking deeper into his very being. There was no turning back now. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon when Naruto entered the village for the first time. His heart pounding in his chest, he stretched out before him the warm golden light of morning over Konoha, his home. But something was different today. The streets were quiet. The usual buzz of life, the chatter of children, calls of vendors, and the sounds of training, were nowhere to be heard. It was as if the whole village had been frozen in time, standing still in response to his presence. As Naruto traversed the familiar paths, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The villagers looked at him at first, a mere flick of the eyes, then a lingering look. He felt their gaze upon him as if a heavy weight had been placed upon his shoulders. The usual contempt, the usual hatred, the usual fear that had been accompanying him for as long as he could remember. It wasn't there. Instead, there was something worse. It was fear. Not the shallow, fleeting fear they had always felt toward him as the Ninetales vessel, but a deeper, more primal kind. Their eyes seemed to recoil from him, and in every whispered conversation, Naruto caught the faintest traces of unease. They couldn't look at him directly. They didn't speak to him. Something had changed. He stopped in front of Ichiraku ramen, the comforting smell of noodles and broth filling the air, but even Tuka, the usually jovial ramen chef, seemed to falter as he noticed Naruto standing there. Tuka's gaze flicked over him with a trace of hesitation, but he said nothing. For a moment, Naruto thought he might say something kind, something that would return to the normalcy he had longed for. But instead, Tuka quickly turned away as if he were afraid to be near him. Naruto clenched his fists, confusion and anger welling up inside of him. What had happened? Was it the village? Was it the power he'd gained in the afterlife? He didn't know, but one thing was sure, he was no longer that same person who had left Konoha days ago. His senses were sharper, his mind clearer. And something inside of him, something darker, pulsed beneath the surface. He continued to avoid him as he walked back to his small, neglected apartment. He didn't pay much mind to the path he took, lost in thought. The silence, when he shut the door behind him, was deafening. He hadn't ever felt like this before. No, this wasn't just loneliness. This was something else. A presence. An awareness that buzzed under his skin, pushing him to act. The moment the door clicked shut, Naruto collapsed onto his bed, his breath shallow. He closed his eyes and instinctively focused inward. A deep, unfamiliar pressure pressed on him. He could feel it, swirling through his body, heavy, dense, like an oppressive fog in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the chakra he had known. This was something different, darker. It almost felt as though the very air around him had thickened. His eyes opened, and for the first time, he felt the pull of the world outside. Life energy of the village. The soft glow of human chakra. The gentle warmth of their soul. It was there, veiled behind walls, behind flesh. And as if he could see it now, like some sort of delicate web connecting everybody to everything, the flow of life, the beat of their existence. Naruto clenched his fists and could feel the electricity under his skin. But without thinking he had flared chakra. But it was not the familiar blue that had always been with him. It seemed darker, more visceral. It was as if blackened energy from death itself. Something was felt to be wrong but almost exhilaratingly powerful. His senses stretched outward into room, village, and beyond. And in an instant, his concentration sprang into focus on something, on a presence, a faint flicker of a soul. He moved his gaze, instinctively pulling himself towards it. Flicking his wrist in the air around him whipped up a whirlwind, and then he saw it, the ghostly form before him, translucent and flickering, in the corner of the room. Its form was disjointed, its features twisted as though it did not belong in this world. The figure seemed to be staring at him with hollow eyes, its expression one of sorrow and fear. Frozen stiff, Naruto felt his heart pounding in his chest. His breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't anything he had ever seen before. No, this was something else. His arm reached out on its own, and a gentle push from his hand made the ghostly form flicker and twist as if it changed according to his whims. A whisper echoed in his ears. Free me. Naruto recoiled, his pulse quickening. The voice wasn't one he could ignore. It spoke to him. It was a plea, a desperate cry for release. The air in the room seemed heavy with the weight of its sorrow. Naruto's hand hovered, unsure. Who? What are you? Naruto whispered, his voice trembling. Why are you here? The ghostly form flickered one last time. Its shape spasmed in a spasm of anguish. It strained forward, a hand trembling towards him as it clawed with its fingers as if to almost touch him. Trapped. Trapped in this world. The whispering voice stated. Let me end the pain. The strange power inside him surged again. It was instinctual, as though the knowledge was suddenly flooding into his mind, as if the Shinigami's presence was lingering in the back of his thoughts. His hand moved on its own, and with a single motion, the figure before him twisted in the air, its form warping as if something was drawing it out, forcing it back into the void. It disappeared with a soft, echoing wail. Naruto gasped, his breath ragged. His heart was racing with confusion and a sickening thrill. What had just happened? What had he done? It was unsettling, but undeniable. He had done something. He'd touched the dead. He'd controlled that spirit. And the power that coursed through him as he did it wasn't his. It was something far darker, far older. The death god's power, coursing through him, guiding every movement. A chill ran down his spine as the full weight of what he had done began to settle in. But before he could even process it fully, his gaze fell upon the small bundle of scrolls sitting on the desk across the room. Forbidden jutsu. Scrolls he had never dared to open. Until now. He moved toward the desk, drawn to them as if they were calling for him. He didn't know why, only that the urge was too powerful to resist. The parchment was old and yellowed, and the symbols in a language he had never seen before, yet somehow he understood it. His fingers shook as he unrolled the scroll. And so the forbidden techniques lay before him, each darker and more twisted than the last. Words seemed to jump off the page, whispering to him, urging him to delve deeper. One in particular caught his eye, a jutsu involving the manipulation of life and death, the summoning of spirits, the creation of puppets from the bodies of the dead. The chest of Naruto was pounding heavily in his chest. That was a forbidden arts jutsu he never tried to master. It was the necromancy, and that was outlawed, something the village didn't allow. But the knowledge it gave was there in his head, pushing him to try. The power was there just waiting for him to take it. Opposing each and every instinct to stop himself, Naruto formed the seals. Air around him chilled as the channeled energy traveled through his body, blending chakra into necromantic energy that had now become part of him. He could feel that the power built within him was now pulling at him and consuming him. And then it happened. Into his room, lifeless and light, came an ordinary bird in form, a sparrow, perhaps for a moment by will to this one. Though its form small was stiff dead, Naruto sent the corpse tumbling, jumping into a brief unnatural twitch and flutter pattern of motion for a moment of life from Naruto. Naruto stepped back, his eyes upon the monster. His breath came in gasps as he marveled at himself. He has taken the soul that was supposed to rest and corrupted it into something that he could control. Something that he could command. It was intoxicating. But as he reveled in his newfound power, a feeling of dread began to settle into the pit of his stomach. This wasn't natural. This wasn't what he had been meant to do. The weight of his actions bore down on him, but he couldn't stop himself. The temptation to explore further, to push his powers to their limits, was too strong. That night, Naruto lay in bed, his mind tormented by nightmares. Souls trapped in torment, their cries echoing in his mind. Whispers begging for release. Their voices haunted him, filling him with an eerie sense of guilt. But Naruto, for the first time, was no longer afraid. He was ready. He would master this power, understand it fully, and use it to reshape everything. He would not be controlled by fear. Not again. Days went by. Naruto continued transforming. It seemed that he mastered his new abilities at a very good pace, but every night, the souls grew louder, and Naruto was between his fascination for his powers and his growing uneasiness in his heart. One thing was certain, he was no longer the same person who had left the village. The world would soon know what he had become. And he would not rest until he had harnessed every bit of the dark power that now flowed through his veins. The road he trod was dangerous now, and Naruto knew with each step, he slipped into darkness. But there was no turning back. Not now. The nights had grown longer, colder. Naruto could feel the weight of the darkness around him pressing in, squeezing the breath from his chest as his mind began to fracture. Every night, without fail, he found himself drifting in and out of dreams, visions so vivid that they felt real, like he was standing on the threshold of the afterlife itself. He saw them, hundreds, thousands of souls, trapped in an endless abyss. Their tortured faces, their wailing voices, echoed in his mind, never ceasing, never fading. But it wasn't just the souls themselves that tormented him. It was the sense of knowledge they carried, knowledge that they offered to him in exchange for their release. Every whisper, every cry, each of them promised something: secrets, forgotten jutsu, lost arts. The Shinigami's realm had a vast library of forgotten techniques, and they were offering them to him, but only if he could free them. Naruto, driven by an insatiable hunger for power and understanding, could not resist. He found himself sinking deeper into the darkness, each soul pulling him further from the light. The whispers filled his every waking moment, a cacophony of voices that never stopped. One such night, as he sat cross-legged on his floor, his eyes narrowed in concentration, the darkness began to pulse around him. His chakra, thick and tainted by the death god's presence, shifted in response to the unseen forces around him. He had been experimenting for days, weeks, with new seals, searching for a way to pull the knowledge from the spirits in a tangible form. His hands shook as he traced the intricate symbols on the paper before him. These were not ordinary seals. No. These were the type of forbidden jutsu he had found in the hidden archives of the village, the type that were sealed away for a reason. Naruto had always been curious about the village's library, that vast collection of ancient texts and scrolls that the villagers treated like a sacred ground. But curiosity had long since turned into obsession. After everything he had been through, after everything he had learned about the power of the Shinigami, he couldn't help but seek the knowledge that was buried deep within the archives. On one of his nightly forays into the library, under the cover of darkness, Naruto had stumbled upon several ancient scrolls. These scrolls were hidden away in a dusty corner, locked behind an old wooden door with seals to protect their contents. But the death god's power coursing through him had allowed Naruto to break through those seals effortlessly. He had spent days poring over their contents, digesting each forbidden technique, each dark ritual. Some were harmless, simple seals. Others, however, were things that no one should ever have dared to master. One of these forbidden rituals had been simple in its nature, an entrapment spell. It allowed the caster to bind fragments of souls to objects or living creatures, tethering them to the material world in a form of unnatural servitude. Naruto had learned the basics quickly, and he began to practice it on smaller creatures. He was cautious at first, testing the waters before diving deeper. But when he raised a bird from the dead, its hollow eyes blinking back at him, lifeless but obedient, he knew he had crossed a line. That had been the first of many. With each experiment, Naruto became more and more enthralled by his ability to manipulate life and death. He began to craft his own techniques, combining the rituals he had learned with his own unique brand of chakra. His experiments grew more dangerous, more ambitious. He had raised entire corpses, turning them into lifeless puppets, controlled by his will. They were nothing more than vessels, empty shells with the souls trapped within them. And they obeyed him. They obeyed him without question. The power was intoxicating, and Naruto could not stop. Every time he used the rituals, he felt the rush of power flooding through him, pulling him further away from the man he had once been. He knew the village would never accept him now, not with the power he wielded, not with the darkness that had become a part of him. But he didn't care. The Shinigami's whispers had become more insistent, urging him to continue his work, to use the knowledge they offered to carve his place in the world. They promised him more power. They promised him the means to control life and death itself. All he had to do was take it. And so he did. But his actions had not gone unnoticed. It was the third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, who first sensed the shift. For days, he had felt the disturbance, an unnatural chakra's signature rising from the vicinity of Naruto's apartment. The chakra was heavy, laden with an aura of death and decay. It was dark, unlike anything Hiruzen had ever felt before. As the Hokage, he had witnessed many strange and powerful jutsu in his lifetime, but this was something different. Hiruzen's suspicions grew, and he began to investigate. He sent his ANBU to watch Naruto, to keep track of his movements. What they reported was disturbing. Naruto was becoming more and more reclusive, more unpredictable. He was no longer the cheerful, loud-mouthed boy he had once known. His behavior was erratic. He had been seen sneaking into the archives late at night, his chakra signature always fluctuating with an unsettling intensity. Hiruzen knew that something had changed in the young shinobi, something dangerous. And so, Hiruzen decided to confront him. The confrontation happened late one evening, in a secluded clearing just outside the village. The wind had a biting chill to it, the air thick with the scent of the forest. Naruto stood alone, his back turned to the approaching figure of the Hokage. He could feel Hiruzen's presence, could sense the weight of the man's gaze. There was no hiding from it. "You've been causing quite a stir, Naruto," Hiruzen said, his voice calm but laced with concern. "Your chakra, it's unlike anything I've ever sensed before. I need to know what's going on." Naruto didn't turn around. His fists clenched at his sides, his entire body vibrating with the dark energy coursing through him. He felt the presence of the souls, the ghosts of the past, swirling around him. They whispered to him, beckoning him to continue, to never stop. But Naruto had already made up his mind. He had been alone for so long. The village had abandoned him. The Hokage had failed him, just like everyone else. "I don't owe you anything, old man," Naruto said, his voice cold, devoid of the warmth it once carried. "You don't understand. You can't. No one can." Hiruzen stepped closer, his face etched with worry. "Naruto, listen to me. I know you've suffered. I know the pain you've carried, but this darkness you're embracing won't lead you anywhere good. You're walking down a path you can't come back from." Naruto's body trembled with rage. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the power bubbling up like a volcano ready to erupt. "Don't lecture me, Hiruzen," he spat. "You've never cared about me. None of you did. You only saw me as a monster, a weapon. But now I'm something more. I can feel it. I can feel the power inside me, and I'm not going to stop. Not for you. Not for anyone." Before Hiruzen could respond, Naruto's hand shot out, his chakra flaring to life. The air around him seemed to distort, warping with the pressure of his power. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a single motion, Naruto summoned a spectral figure, a translucent form flickering into existence in front of him. It was the spirit of a long-dead shinobi, bound to the world by the dark power Naruto now commanded. Hiruzen's eyes widened in shock and horror as the figure moved toward him. "Naruto, no," he shouted, raising his hand to stop the creature. But the ghost didn't listen. It was bound to Naruto's will, and it surged forward with a shriek that echoed through the forest. The Hokage barely managed to dodge, his movements swift and precise, but the spirit was relentless. It swiped at him, its ghostly fingers leaving a trail of cold, deathly air in their wake. "Enough!" Hiruzen bellowed, his voice full of authority and power. He summoned his own chakra, releasing a massive wave of energy that pushed the spirit back. The spectral form disintegrated into mist, but Naruto stood there, unshaken, his expression dark and resolute. "You can't stop me," Naruto said quietly, his voice laced with finality. "No one can." Hiruzen's heart sank. The boy he had once seen as a son was now lost to the darkness. And there was no telling how far Naruto would go or how much damage he would cause. With that, Naruto turned his back and walked away, leaving the Hokage standing in the shadows of the past, the future uncertain, and the village unknowingly on the brink of chaos. Naruto's descent had only just begun. Naruto could feel the weight of his new identity pressing down on him. The words of the Hokage, after the confrontation with Hiruzen, echoed in his mind, his warnings, his pleas. But Naruto was beyond that now. He was no longer the naive boy who had longed for acceptance. That boy had died the moment he made his pact with the Shinigami, and in his place stood someone far darker, far more dangerous. He walked the streets of Konoha, his presence an undeniable force. The villagers, once so eager to ignore him, now avoided his gaze. Whispers followed him, but Naruto couldn't bring himself to care. Every passing glance, every sideways look, only confirmed the distance between him and the rest of the world. He was alone. He had always been alone. The villagers had rejected him for years and now feared him. It felt right. They had no place in his life anymore. Iruka, however, was different. The ever-persistent teacher who had once tried to reach him, who had shown him the kindness that no one else had, seemed to be the only one who still believed in the boy he once was. Iruka approached him that evening, a hopeful look in his eyes, but Naruto couldn't bring himself to face the man who had been his only semblance of family in the village. "Naruto," Iruka called out gently, his voice laced with concern. "I've been worried about you. You've been acting strange lately. Please, talk to me. What's going on?" Naruto didn't answer. His eyes were cold, focused on the ground in front of him. He could feel the rising tension in the air, the familiar weight of the Shinigami's presence in his chest. The whispers of the trapped souls were louder than ever, urging him to embrace his power, to accept the isolation that would inevitably come with it. "I don't need anyone," Naruto muttered under his breath, his voice almost inaudible. Iruka reached out, putting a hand on Naruto's shoulder, but the young shinobi flinched back from the touch. It wasn't fear that drove him to recoil, but something far darker, a deep, unshakable hatred. The touch of another person only reminded him of how weak he had been, how vulnerable he had once been to the world's cruelty. He wasn't that boy anymore. "Iruka," Naruto said, his voice now low and tinged with bitterness, "you don't understand. None of you do. You think you can help me, but you can't. I've made my choice." Iruka's eyes softened, but Naruto could see the sadness in them. "Naruto, please, you don't have to walk this path alone." But Naruto had stopped listening. His thoughts had moved away from the conversation and to darker thoughts, darker places. His fist closed in upon itself as the power of the Shinigami within him growled and clawed to be let free. A hunger began to stir within his chest, one that could only be quenched by more power, control, and fear. Iruka's voice cracked as Naruto turned away from him, presenting his back to the teacher. "Please, Naruto, do not go down this path. It will destroy you." Naruto didn't say anything. He couldn't. His heart was already gone too far. As he walked through the village, the weight of the stairs upon him grew heavier. He knew the villagers were afraid of him now, and he could sense their fear like a tangible presence in the air. It made him feel invincible, but also increasingly isolated. The streets that once felt like a second home now felt like a cage. The bullying which would now, each day go with no signs had ceased long before then. Villagers feared even trying. Others continued seeking him, people sensing he had become a man changed. His powers did them nothing but good. It started when he was walking home one evening, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. A group of former classmates, who had once laughed at him, now found themselves in his path. The boy who had been their target for so long was now something they feared, something they didn't understand. They pushed at him trying to move on, low mumblings of insults in the air. But Naruto felt the fear. It was heavy, palpable, alive. The spirit's whispers prodded him to move, to show them something, to make them understand that they meant nothing to him. They tried pushing him again, but Naruto did not react this time. His chakra was swelling inside his chest, and without thinking he stretched out his hand. The air around him crackled and spectral chains erupted from the ground and bound the bullies in place. They were black, curled like serpents, the edges sharp and cold. Screams of terror sounded from the bullies as chains wrapped around their limbs, closing tighter with every passing second. "No. Let go. Please." One cried out, his voice rising with panic. Naruto was holding still, watching the bullies struggle against their chains as an eerie light flashed in his eyes. They had no chance whatsoever, as their binding force didn't break but instead got intensified by Naruto and his dark powers. The whispers of the trapped souls echoed in his mind, urging him to take it further, break them completely, and show them who was boss. But Naruto restrained himself by just a little bit. He really had no need to kill them, not yet at least. He made his point. With a flick of his wrist, the chains loosened, and the bullies fell to the ground, gasping for breath. They scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with terror, and without a word, they ran. Naruto stood in silence, the dark power within him still thrumming with energy. He felt the rush of power, the satisfaction of asserting his dominance. It was intoxicating, and it made him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. But as he turned his back and walked away, reality struck him. The villagers would talk. His power would be the talk of the village, and it was only a matter of time before the whole village would turn against him. But that no longer mattered. They were weak. They were scared. And soon, he would be out of their reach. Whispers from the souls in the realm of the Shinigami came louder, goading him now to fully indulge in the darkness, to take what he owed. He felt the path in front of him, dark and twisted, yet clear. No longer was he a boy struggling for acceptance, he was something else now, something greater. As the days went by, the rumors of his dark powers spread like wildfire throughout Konoha. The villagers whispered in hushed tones, casting fearful glances whenever he passed. They no longer saw the brash, loud-mouthed kid who had once been a source of annoyance. Instead, they saw a force to be reckoned with, a walking nightmare. Naruto embraced it. But with fear came opportunity. The outcasts, rogue shinobi, and all those long abandoned by society started to find their way to him. They sensed his strength, the power that was released from him like an unstoppable force. They saw not only a broken boy but a leader, a symbol of rebellion against the established order. The outcasts began forming alliances with him. They weren't his friends, not like Irika. No, they were useful. They could help him take control. They could help him build an army that no one could defeat. They could help him bring about the change he sought. His rebellion was still in its infancy, but it was growing. And each day that went by was fueling Naruto's power. The village, once his home, would soon be nothing but a memory, a place for the weak, a place for those who had never understood his true potential. The chains of the living were now his to command. And no one, not even the Hokage, would be able to stop him. Naruto's experiments with his newfound power had taken a darker turn. His obsession with necromancy was consuming him, but he couldn't stop. The whispers from the souls trapped within the Shinigami's realm grew louder each night, their voices growing more insistent, more urgent, as if begging him to harness his abilities to their fullest. The spirits that now called out to him, their once anguished cries now more like whispers of twisted wisdom, pushed him further into the abyss. His first attempts had been crude. He had raised small animals, stray dogs, birds, and rodents, testing the limits of his control. It had been a way to feel his power, to experiment without consequence. The animals did his every bidding, moving as puppets on strings, their hollow eyes tracking his every move. The sense of power was heady. But the animals were not enough. Naruto had evolved to something far greater, something that would push him to places he could hardly have imagined. That night, he decided to raise his first human corpse. Was the night everything changed. Naruto had spent the last few days going over forbidden scrolls, looking for any knowledge he could find on necromantic techniques. There were whispers of the forbidden art that was hidden in the dark corners of Konoha's archives and was left untouched by most shinobi because of consequences. But Naruto no longer feared consequences. In his eyes, the world already rejected him. In turn, he owed nothing to anyone. The body he went for was an ANBU operative warrior, who a fortnight later had died unendorsed within a mission set by himself, while Naruto only managed to pick him from secret stores in a corner of a dead body depot at the medical wing of hospital in Konoha's. None of that cared him about to know who was he or whose past. There only mattered this, the extent of power if the corpse regained its life at his hands. With a steady hand, Naruto traced the seals on the ground surrounding the body. Glowing with that spectral energy flowing through him now, he anticipated the heart-quickened pulsation that should be generated at the ritual activation. Dark energies hummed to life around him, and his earth trembled beneath his weight, the spirit whispers stirring with enthusiasm. The body twitched. Naruto's breath catches as he gazes at the ANBU operative's fingers moving stiffly, then by the jerky, sluggish motions of his limbs. His eyes had been dull and empty and dry, a dark hollow shell, but they sprang open suddenly and all there was to them was darkness. It worked. Naruto's done it. He revived a corpse. It had been much more complicated than anything he had ever tried before, but it felt right, instinctual, even. He could feel the power flowing through him, a force far greater than anything he had ever imagined. He spoke a single word, a command, and the body obeyed without question, its movements stiff and mechanical. Naruto watched his creation with cold satisfaction. The operative stood at attention, his body a mere vessel for Naruto's will. It was strange, this puppet that had once been a man was now his to control, his power embodied in the form of another's corpse. And yet, Naruto could feel a growing connection to the soul bound within it. It was as if the spirits were drawn to him, amplifying his power, guiding his hand. The more he commanded, the clearer the whispers grew, their voices speaking to him in fragments of lost knowledge, revealing secrets of Konoha, of the village's hidden sins and betrayals. As night fell, Naruto continued to refine his technique by practicing with the reanimated corpse in combat. He pushed the body through a series of moves, striking the air with precision and deadly force, testing the limits of his control. It responded perfectly, as if it were still alive, still capable of fighting like it had when it was a trained ANBU operative. Every command strengthened the connection to the corpse, expanded his power. But the resurrection came at a cost. The more Naruto utilized his power, the more he felt the pull of it was upon him. It was powerful, the necromantic energy was, but also draining, like it fed off of his own life force. He could feel his chakra darkening, more oppressive, as well as how deep his bond to the spirits had become. It was always a fight for control, fighting against the full takeover of the darkness within. Still, Naruto pushed forward. He was no longer that naive boy who had longed for acceptance. That part of him had died the moment he made that pact with the Shinigami. Now, he was something else. Something far darker. The power flowing through him was intoxicating, and he wouldn't let it go. Not long had passed before the word of his activities reached ears. The council had picked up on the weird energy that emanated from Naruto, the unusual happenings associated with his presence. The rumors that had long been confined to the shadows of the village now reached the ears of the highest Konoha leadership. The council began to investigate, and their eyes now turned toward Naruto with growing suspicion. Rumors spread of what he was doing, how he had resurrected the dead, how his chakra had become darker, more sinister. Some said he was mad, that the boy who had once symbolized hope was now corrupted by the very darkness he had once fought against. Others feared the power he now commanded, the ability to control life and death, and what he might do with it. The council debated what to do with Naruto. Some pushed for his immediate execution, fearing the threat he posed to Konoha's stability. Others argued for his imprisonment, believing that the boy was too dangerous to be allowed free. They feared what would happen if Naruto's power continued to grow unchecked, if he began to use his abilities on a larger scale. But the whispers of the spirits, they kept getting louder in Naruto's mind, urging him forward to claim what was rightfully his. They spoke of the years-long betrayals and corruption at the heart of the leadership of Konoha. They whispered of secrets buried deep in the village archives, of the dark deals and the twisted politics that had shaped the future of Konoha. The spirits gave him the knowledge he needed to bring it all to light, to expose the truth, and to make those who had wronged him pay. Anger flared in Naruto as he absorbed that knowledge. Pain, suffering, at the hands of Konoha, now felt like a wound that could no longer be ignored. He had been cast aside, treated like a tool, a weapon to be used and discarded. The villagers had shunned him, the Hokage had kept his distance, and the villagers had never seen him as anything more than a weapon, a tool to be used in their endless games of power. They had never seen him for what he truly was. But he would make them see. With a cold determination, Naruto stood in the middle of the dead of night, standing before the graves of fallen heroes of Konoha. His hands were held up, eyes glowing with spectral energy now that flowed through his veins. Whispers of the spirits swirled around him, urging him to act, urging him to raise an army of the dead, to bring forth the fallen, and make Konoha bow to him. The ground shook with him, as the earth tore open with dark energy, chanting into the sky. The dark energy in the air began building up, responding to his calls, as if spirits rose up from their grave. One after another, dead shinobi corpses began to shift, their bodies jerking as if coming alive under Naruto's command. In a row of silence, waiting for their master's order, they stood still. Naruto smiled as the undead soldiers assembled before him. They were his army now. His pawns in the game he was about to play. And Konoha, with all its strength and all its secrets, would soon fall at his feet. The time had come to make them all pay. The time had come to bring Konoha to its knees. Naruto stood on the edge of the forest of death, his gaze sweeping across the twisted trees and dense foliage that had once been home to countless trials for aspiring shinobi. Now, it was his domain, a place of darkness, where he could work without interference, and where his power would grow. His horde of zombies had already grown. Spectral soldiers and walking dead patrolled the perimeter of his secret base. His dream of revolution was growing, and he knew it would not be long before Konoha would feel the tremors of his vengeance. He had waited for months to make small strategic moves, playing with the bounds of his potential. But now, the mutterings of his name had spilled out of Konoha's borders. The outcasts, the rogue shinobi, and the villains who had long been overlooked by the village saw something they hadn't seen in years: strength. Power. A shot at controlling their own futures, a shot at rising up against the tyranny of the village that had cast them aside. Naruto wasn't interested in forming alliances based on mutual trust or understanding. He had no use for the ideals of friendship or loyalty that once held his world together. What mattered now was power and the vision to wield it. His heart had been hardened by the betrayals of Konoha, and he had long since abandoned any notion of redemption. He had made a pact with the death god, and now, he would use the power granted to him to tear down everything that had once controlled him. His base in the forest of death was a hidden sanctuary, protected by the creatures of the dark and the dead who now served him. The spectral warriors were bound to him, their souls tethered to his will. But his army was still growing. Naruto had begun to recruit those willing to join him, those with no place in the shinobi world, and those drawn by the promise of chaos and revolution. He took in rogue ninjas, criminals, and all who thirst for power and slowly began to assemble them deep within the forest. Naruto was a leader now, but he wasn't like the Hokage. His rule was not of mercy or compassion, but built upon fear, because he knew he could crush any opposition that may arise against him. He needed no approval from the villagers. His mind was set on something greater. Down in his underground hideout, Naruto continued experimenting with his powers. His ability to blend his chakra with necromantic energy had reached a new level. The fusion of the two forces allowed him to create hybrid techniques that were unlike anything he had ever seen. Spectral explosions, blasts of ethereal energy that could tear through flesh and bone, and shadow constructs warriors made of darkness that obeyed his every command. The more he experimented, the more potent his powers became. Naruto stood amidst a mess of scrolls and scratchings, covered in dark energy-thickened air. Chakras combined with necromancies opened new lines of possibility. New ways in which he'd be able to destroy and, by extension, control. They'd begun melding the energy of his own chakra within the souls brought back into rotting corpses by the reanimation rites, filling these reanimated core with power to be stronger, faster and more powerful for their sake and his. His army was no longer limited to mere puppets of death. They were warriors, beings of shadow and bone who would fight for him without question. Your power is only beginning, the voice of the death god whispered in his mind, the deep, spectral presence always there, guiding him. What you create here will change the world. Naruto's eyes flickered to a faint, ethereal glow as he prepared himself for the next challenge. A crack of his fingers and the air shimmered, and one of the reanimated corpses, an elite shinobi who fell in battle long ago, leaped from the earth. The corpse's eyes were empty, jerky movements, stiff but made stronger and more alert with chakra. Its eyes remained focused on Naruto as it awaited the shinobi's command. Attack, Naruto muttered, his voice low and growly. The body moved like a shadow, quick and fluid, leaping out at a dummy standing nearby. The impact was explosive. The dummy's punches shredded through it, leaving a cloud of debris and dust. Naruto watched with a cold satisfaction as the body rose to its feet, waiting for its next order. And day passed into day. His army grew and grew. More outcasts joined, all of them bringing their respective skills and abilities to the group. Some of these people were formerly members of the ninja clans found within the village, spurned for their weaknesses or lack of loyalty to the other clans. Others were cold-blooded criminals, wanted men and women, who had been running for years. But one thing united the entire group: they all coveted power. Each had been attracted by the promise presented by Naruto's rebellion. But Naruto knew that more than just an army, he needed control. He wanted the village to quiver with fear at his mere mention. He wanted to send a message. One night, meditating in the center of his underground lair, a commotion was sent rife through the air. His neck hairs rose on end as he could sense several shinobi were there. His instincts flared. No doubt, they were ANBU sent to spy on him. He knew it was only a matter of time before the village acted, but he had hoped for more time to consolidate his power. His eyes narrowed. The hour for prudence had passed. The hour to strike had come. Out into the woods, Naruto walked, listening to all that surrounded him. In his mind, the spirits whispered among each other, their voices grew more excited and urged him forward to unleash his anger. As he moved, the undead minions followed, disappearing into the shadows to prepare for when he would order them to strike. The ANBU team wore silence, silent as they were moving through the forest with the deadly precision masked by their signatures. They had been trained for threats like this, but the boy Naruto had long since grown out of his weak, naive self. Naruto was a force, an unstoppable power, and he had begun to embrace his darkness. He ambushed them. In a single swift movement, Naruto had created his shadow constructs, tall dark figures of churning energy them from within the forest as if to close the ANBU's path. The ANBU squad hesitated for a second, unsure what they were encountering, but that was enough time for Naruto. He snapped his fingers. Spectral chains shot forth from the ground, looping around the members like nothing could stop them. They bound and immobilized each one of the ANBU members, preventing them from moving or breaking free. The shadows flitted about on their own, wrapping arms and legs into painful holds that prevented them from moving. "Get up," Naruto said, his voice icy. "Move. Attack them." The reanimated ANBU soldiers lunged at their former comrades, with the battle being swift and merciless. The fight was fierce as the ANBU fought valiantly, but they were outmatched by Naruto's army, who outnumbered them. Spectral chains tightened, and 2 of the members of the ANBU were dead, their bodies falling lifeless to the ground before they could react. Naruto's cold eyes locked onto the corpses as they were reanimated with chakra-infused energy pumping through their limbs. The 2 ANBU became part of his army, and their souls would be bound to his will. He had taken them for himself. With the fight over, Naruto stood amidst a sea of lifeless ANBU. His eyes twinkled in elation at a job well done. The world had seen one thing and made it well understood: do not mess with me. Do not play around and think me weak. He's more than that, he is a destruction element, and they would see within Konoha, soon enough, that the whole time they thought them in control. As the last of the ANBU were brought back to life and joined his increasing army, Naruto stood up, his heart beating with exhilaration. Determination burned within his eyes as whispers of spirits sounded in his head, calling for him to move forward. The storm is coming, and Konoha is at its epicenter. The wind screamed down the forest of death, this being the only sound punctuating the morose silence that was now over those twisted trees. A new force had sprouted within the guts of the forest, one even darker than whatever creature had been born from its entrails. It was an army built by Naruto the Undead, born from dark rites and twisted, necromancing power. However, he didn't have nearly enough. There was still far too much need for power and control. The outcasts and rogue shinobi who had joined him were loyal, but loyalty was a fragile thing. It could be swayed, broken, or betrayed. Naruto knew this all too well. To create an empire that would never fall, he had to tie his followers to him in ways no simple thread of death could. Thus, he had devised a way to tie their souls to his soul-binding contracts that would forever tether them to his will. Naruto sat in the heart of his underground lair, the dim light of a single candle flickering beside him. Before him was a sealed scroll, an ancient parchment that held the key to his next move. He had acquired it from a rogue seal master, one of the few who had survived his brutal campaign of capturing those who might possess useful knowledge. This man had once been a respected member of the village, but in his desperation for power, he had fallen out of favor with Konoha. Now, he would serve Naruto's purpose. The rogue master seal had been tortured for days, his mind unraveling with each scream as Naruto extracted every bit of forbidden knowledge from him. With each shriek, with each tear, Naruto learned something new to fortify his necromantic ability, twisting them into something a lot more potent. It was cruel, but he had no other choice but to comply, and Naruto was only too willing to ensure that the man did so with pain. With a flick of his wrist, Naruto opened the scroll, staring wide-eyed at the intricate seals and markings written with blood. These were no simple seals that academy students learned. These were forbidden techniques, ones even experienced seal masters might not dare to use. But Naruto had no such qualms. He was beyond that now. He had crossed the threshold and could never go back. He spoke the words of the spell, whispering them, as his fingers ran along the markings on the parchment. Gradually, the air began to vibrate with power. The room was covered in a dark aura, and Naruto's eyes were aglow with anticipation as he felt the energy flowing through him. He was doing something far more deadly than signing a simple contract. This was a bond of souls, a binding that would guarantee that his followers would not leave him, no matter the cost. But once the seal was complete, the scroll ignited flames that danced and swirled into his hands. Naruto's breath grew labored as power settled in his system. The contract was sealed. He could now command his followers without question, their souls fixed to him in a way not even death could break. But Naruto wasn't content with mere contracts. He had grander ambitions and an all-insatiable thirst for power. He wanted information, Konoha's weaknesses, its secrets. And the best place to find that information was the Hokage's tower. The Hokage's tower was a symbol of authority and power in Konoha. There, the most important decisions were made, secrets of the village were kept, and the jutsu which could shape the future of the shinobi world were hidden. Naruto had been studying the tower from afar, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It came on a moonless night, the dark providing him cover. Naruto had long since mastered the art of using his ghostly abilities to move unseen. He slipped through shadows like a phantom, and he never needed a disguise. His power was enough to mask his presence from anyone watching. He moved with ease, the chakras surrounding him mingling with the shadows as he traversed the corridors like a specter. His senses heightened, his eyes scanning each and every corner, each doorway. The building seemed silent, as if it too knew to dread his arrival. Naruto had but one thing on his mind, the secret vaults. He had heard rumors of a series of confidential documents, sealed away in the deepest reaches of the tower, that detailed Konoha's most guarded secrets. These were not the types of scrolls found in the public archives. They were locked away for a reason, because they contained information about the village's weaknesses, about the Jinchuriki, and about the experiments that had been conducted in secret. Such had been shaping Naruto's existence. His heart began to beat faster with each step down the tower, the coldness in the air almost chilling to his skin, as well as the smell of old paper and ink that now filled his nostrils. He had arrived at the vaults. With one hand movement, he contracted his chains to bind the sealed door, the muscles of his back tensing to pop it open. The vault was filled with scrolls, each one carefully bound and marked with intricate seals. Naruto's eyes gleamed as he began to sift through them, his fingers brushing over the delicate parchment. The first scroll he opened was a report detailing the history of the Jinchuriki. It spoke of the experiments conducted on the vessels of the tailed beasts, and how the village had long been in search of a way to control the powers of these beings. Naruto's eyes burned with fury as he read about the methods used to torture and manipulate the Jinchuriki, about the countless lives that had been sacrificed in the name of power. He knew what it was like to be a vessel, to be trapped in a body that was not your own. The village never cared for the people they used, never cared for the pain they endured. The list of weaknesses. It included such things as defenses weak in that particular village, secret paths, and tunnels. These were the ones he had sought for. Then with that knowledge he could attack at Konoha's very heart, it would blow out the root foundation of that village. The third scroll made him sit straighter. It was written in a language he didn't recognize, and its seals pulsed with dark energy. When he opened it, he felt a sudden wave of power that made the air around him crackle with electricity. The scroll contained information about the Shinigami, the very entity that had granted him his power. It spoke of rituals, of ancient practices that could summon the Shinigami's avatar, an entity of immense strength that could defend and protect the summoner from any threat. Naruto smiled to himself at the thought, his lips twisted upwards at the corners. This could be his trump card, the ultimate avatar of a Shinigami, monstrous enough to strike fear into anyone's heart who ever dared to cross him. This power would make him capable of defending his territory, crushing those who opposed him, and further solidifying his dominance over Konoha and the shinobi world as a whole. He stuffed the scroll into his cloak and turned to leave, but not before stopping in front of a window nearby. From there, he could see the whole village, the rooftops, the streets, the people who had once treated him like a pariah. His heart burned with hatred as he thought of the years of torment, the isolation, the rejection. Konoha had made him what he was, but they would regret ever underestimating him. As he stepped back into the shadows, Naruto's mind was already set on the next step. He would summon the Shinigami's avatar, and he would use it to protect his growing empire. He would carve out his place in the world, and no one, not even the Hokage, would stand in his way. It was the time to do something more. Destiny had cast their chains in place, and it was now preparing for a storm. Konoha was going down. Under the moonless sky, the forest seemed eerily quiet. The oppressive darkness was making the air feel thicker. Naruto stood at the edge of his territory, gazing out over the stretch of land he had claimed as his own. The forest of death was no longer just a place of isolation and fear. This was his kingdom, the land of death, and his constant companion that he had wielded for many years, and his army of the dead multiplied day after day, spreading influence far beyond the borders of the forest. But Konoha, the village who abandoned him, was not passive at that. Council made its final verdict. Their powers were outgrowing more than they would want them to grow. They did dispatch their very elite Jonin and ANBU forces to crush him. Wipe him from this earth altogether, stamp out all of the dark, evil spirit that he led alive with those elite shinobis. The result was disastrous for them, as they proved utterly wrong. He listened attentively as the vibrations reached his ears and felt the pulse in the ground. This was it? Naruto smiled cynically, as if he'd run through countless plans in the past few days leading up to this battle. He had long prepared for such an attack. The shinobi of Konoha were well trained, but there was no hope against the evils he had loosed upon the earth. Under Naruto's feet, the ground rolled, and the trees groaned, giving off a feeling that they were living. Spectral guardians came out of the shadows, rising like phantoms from the earth itself. They formed their ranks, fixed eyes hollowly on the approaching force. These weren't simply the reanimated corpses he had used before. These were his personal creations, silent, deadly sentinels, bound to him through rituals beyond the comprehension of the average shinobi. As the council's forces advanced through the forest, they had no idea what awaited them. They were prepared for the fight of their lives, but nothing could have prepared them for the nightmare they were about to face. The trees seemed to shift and bend as if alive, and from the underbrush, ghostly figures emerged, their forms flickering in and out of existence. The first wave of Jonin and ANBU operatives fell into the trap. He stood in the midst of that turmoil, with fiery eyes ablaze in a malevolent blaze that spoke to untold potential power. One slight movement brought a seal of forbidden magic upon the scene, one so hazardous, it was stored away in some dark corner of the very Konoha's records themselves. The ground shook as black tendrils of energy shot from the earth, binding the fallen shinobi's bodies to Naruto's will. These were no longer their former selves, but puppets, reanimated corpses with no will of their own, forced to fight for the one who had brought them back. The first of the ANBU operatives tried to retreat, but the ground beneath their feet twisted, causing them to stumble and fall. Naruto's spectral chains shot out from the shadows, coiling around the retreating figure, dragging him back into the chaos. His life force was siphoned away in an instant, and the power flowed into Naruto, strengthening him with each fallen enemy. The battle unfolded in a blur of bloodshed. The air was full of chakra as Naruto soaked up the energy of the dead, and it grew exponentially within him. He was more than a man, and he was going to become an unstoppable storm. Nothing could keep him at bay. Corpses of fallen shinobi sprouted from the earth, their blank eyes staring and sightless, like a macabre army of the dead who turned against comrades. It is a horrific cycle of death and rebirth, with every participant in the battle feeding Naruto's strength evermore. The best Jonin fought hard but could not overcome the horrors before them. With every blow, a retaliatory surge of dark energy returned to them. Every enemy killed merely fueled Naruto's power more. His chakra now resonated with hundreds, thousands perhaps, of lost souls. It seemed the forest itself had come alive through the sound of death, as screams and cries of battle became intertwined with whispers of spirits which Naruto had shackled to his will. The operatives fell, one by one. The fight went on for hours, blood thick in the air. It was a scent that made a chill run along the spines of even seasoned warriors. For Naruto's laugh sent a dark tinge to the world as he sounded through the trees. He had no end in sight. He raised his hand and the final Jonin toppled over, collapsing to the ground. The ground trembled and one final wave of spectral energy went out as the remaining operatives ran in terror. They had seen enough, witnessed enough horror to realize that they were not prepared for the monster they had let loose. Naruto stood amidst the carnage, his eyes aglow with otherworldly light, and the dead lay still, their hollow eyes staring into nothingness. The battle was over, but the forest would never be the same. Naruto stood on a hill of corpses, the bones of his enemies littering the ground around him like the remnants of a forgotten war. His chest rose and fell with each heavy breath, but his expression was one of cold triumph. He had won. Konoha's forces had been decimated, and his power had only grown. The whispers of the spirits grew louder now, and with every passing moment, they offered him more power, more knowledge. But it was the words etched into the very fabric of the forest that drew his attention. This was no longer just the forest of death. This was his kingdom. The kingdom of shadows, Naruto declared with a voice blowing across the wind. His words echoed, reverberating through the trees as if it was answering his command. That was the night when the kingdom of shadows was born, so was the era. No more was Naruto the pariah, the victim of Konoha's cruelty. No more was he going to be tied up by them and their rules and restrictions. He was above all that now. He stood above the ashes of an old world and would carve out a destiny of his own. And with that, as the last remaining survivors of the battle scurry back to Konoha with their hearts filled with fear and desperation, Naruto prepares for the next phase of his plan. This was just a beginning, he wasn't going to let it go here. He was not satisfied with just this victory. The kingdom of shadows would rise to power, and with it, he would make Konoha and the entire shinobi world pay for the suffering they had inflicted upon him. The storm had only just begun. Naruto stood in the middle of the forest of death, with the stench of rotting flesh and the heavy oppression of power all around him. His domain had expanded, and now it was a living testament to his rise, a dark kingdom built on the bones of his enemies. The whispers of spirits, once faint, now filled his mind, growing louder as his control over death deepened. He had grown into something more than a simple shinobi. He was power, darkness that spread across the land, and nothing at all would stand in his path. His new ability to manipulate souls had taken on forms both horrific and fascinating. He could now extract the very essence of a person's soul and reshape it, binding it to his will. The process was agonizing, the spirits trapped in a state between life and death, their suffering feeding his power. But it was a small price to pay for the power it gave him. The latest experiment of Naruto proved a success. His Shadow Council, the first of many such groups, comprised his most devoted followers, men and women he had resurrected from beyond life and whose spirits were bound to him by powerful seals. Each of them had been a ninja in the past life, and now, they simply followed his orders. They had no will of their own, no thoughts outside his commands. They were his perfect soldiers, willing to fight and die in his name. Each member of his council had a different purpose. There was Ryo, an ANBU operative who had left that life and was now a former assassin, unmatched in stealth and assassination. Her spirit, once violent and fierce, was now calm and obedient, her loyalty unwavering. Then there was Haruto, a skilled medicnin whose healing powers were turned into a weapon for Naruto's cause. His soul had been twisted, his sense of compassion replaced with blind devotion to his master. And then there was Tetsuya, a former elite jonin whose mastery of elemental jutsu made him an ideal strategist for Naruto's growing army. Together, they formed the backbone of his power, and under their guidance, Naruto's influence spread further. His army of the undead swelled, their ranks filled with the spirits of fallen shinobi, their bodies animated by Naruto's dark power. The forest of death was no longer just a place of isolation, it was a fortress, a place where Naruto's enemies could never reach him, a place where his plans could unfold without interference. Back in Konoha, though, things were getting pretty serious. The council was in a mess, still reeling from the devastating defeat they had taken at the hands of Naruto. The loss of their elite Jonin and ANBU operatives left them feeling vulnerable, and fear gripped the village. The once unshakable confidence of Konoha was crumbling now, and among the villagers there were whispers about the demon who returned to claim his vengeance. The third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, had a heavy burden on his heart. He had watched Naruto grow up, could see the boy suffer from the weight of the village's scorn, and he never made an effort to save him. Now, Naruto had become something that no one expected. The power gathered by him was beyond imagination, and Hiruzen realized that Konoha had no chance of defeating him in its own ground. The Hokage had already started considering desperate measures. There were old techniques, forbidden jutsu, sealed away for a reason, but each day made it worse. The more Naruto's power grew out of control, the closer to collapse the village would be. And if the village fell, everything Hiruzen had spent his life on, everything he had vowed to protect, was lost. However, Hiruzen was not the only one who had his concerns. A well-known face had signed up for the mission to check on Naruto's strength, Kakashi Hatake. He was a man who was no stranger to the darker aspects of the shinobi world and had the experience to make him the perfect man for the task. But even Kakashi, with his Sharingan and a whole arsenal of techniques, knew that this would not be a simple mission. Naruto had changed. He was no longer that simple child who he once used to be, rather, a being of innumerable powers, a creature whose motives shrouded into the darkness. The mission that Kakashi was entrusted with was straightforward. He was to penetrate into Naruto's domain, calculate his strength, and return to headquarters with that knowledge. But in truth, this mission was way riskier than what Kakashi could have anticipated. As Kakashi entered the forest of death, he sensed a change in the air's gravity. The very atmosphere seemed to warp around him, as if the forest itself was alive. The trees twisted, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to grasp him. The whispers of spirits filled his ears, and every step he took felt heavier, more oppressive. He had been in many dangerous situations before, but this was different. The forest felt like a living nightmare. Not long after that, he found Naruto. The monster was standing in the middle of a clearing, his eyes aglow with unnatural light. His chakra was nothing like anything Kakashi had ever felt before, it was dark and suffocating. It was as if the air around him bent and twisted to his will. Naruto's power was palpable, and it was overwhelming. Naruto looked at Kakashi with a calm, almost bored expression. "So, the legendary copy ninja has come to spy on me," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "How predictable. How quaint." Kakashi's hand rose automatically to the headband in preparation to rip open his Sharingan if the need arose. "Naruto," he said, a little steady with concern. "What you are doing? It's not a shinobi way. You can't come back from this kind of line." Naruto's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I don't need to follow the rules of Konoha anymore. I am beyond that now. The chains that once bound me have been broken. I am free." His voice was like a whisper carried by the wind, yet it echoed in Kakashi's mind with terrifying clarity. Kakashi tried to remain calm, his Sharingan now fully activated, but the weight of Naruto's power was like a heavy weight on his chest. It was as if the very world around him was being suffocated by Naruto's presence. Kakashi's heart raced, but he knew that he couldn't back down. He was here to assess Naruto's strength, to learn whatever he could so that Konoha could find a way to stop him. Naruto raised a hand, and in that instant, the ground beneath Kakashi's feet shifted. Spectral chains shot up from the earth, coiling around his limbs with the precision of a skilled shinobi. The chains glowed with a dark, oppressive energy, and Kakashi felt his chakra being drained away, his body growing heavier as if his very soul was being sucked from him. Kakashi gritted his teeth and struggled against the chains. However, they were too strong, and with each struggle, they constricted further, holding him in place. His chakra flared up in a final attempt to break free, but it was no use. Naruto's power was absolute. Foolish, Naruto muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. You thought you could evaluate my strength? You can't even move. You're nothing but a puppet caught in my strings. Kakashi's mind raced. He couldn't defeat Naruto in this state. His only hope was to survive and gather as much information as he could. But Naruto wasn't finished yet. Instead of killing Kakashi, Naruto released the chains with a flick of his wrist. Kakashi collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body sore from the strain of the chakra-draining chains. He looked up at Naruto, his eyes wide with disbelief. Consider this a warning, Naruto said, his voice cold and unfeeling. Konoha's time is running out. You can send your strongest to challenge me, but it will be useless. I have already won. With one final, disdainful glance, Naruto turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Kakashi to recover and return to Konoha with the grim news. Kakashi stumbled back to the village, his heart heavy with what he had witnessed. Naruto had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. He was no longer the boy who had dreamed of becoming Hokage. He was something else entirely, a being of darkness and power, and Konoha was helpless against him. As Kakashi left to head back into Konoha, he couldn't help but ponder just how much time the village had left before Naruto's reign of terror would be unavoidable. Naruto stood atop the mountain ridge, his eyes staring out at the horizon where the dark clouds churned, gathering with the intensity of a storm long foretold. The wind whispered through the skeletal trees of the Forest of Death, a place that had once been synonymous with death and fear, now an emblem of his growing empire. He became much more than just a shinobi, a messenger of death, a sower of chaos, and a lord in his twisted empire. He'd made himself feared all over the earth. As he stood above and gazed at the remainder of the earth, he felt that time itself would see this too under his hand. The whispers in the back of his mind grew louder with every passing day. Spirits, those whose souls he had bound to his will, now guided his steps, sharing with him ancient knowledge, forgotten jutsu, and strategies from times long past. Every battle he fought, every life he extinguished, added to his power. He had raised an army of the dead, a mindless horde of shinobi and warriors, but his true strength lay in something more. He had begun resurrecting the greatest minds of the past, summoning legendary shinobi from the forgotten wars, using their knowledge to refine his own techniques, to perfect his mastery over necromancy. His plan was simple: reshape the shinobi world in his own image, to bend it to his will. Konoha was the first, but they wouldn't be the last. His emissaries, loyal agents who carried his word, had already begun to spread across the other hidden villages, sending whispers of his growing power and the chaos he had wrought. Fear and uncertainty followed in their wake, and Naruto reveled in it. He was no longer the outcast he once was, he had become the master of life and death itself. The emissaries were his instruments of terror. They infiltrated the other villages under the guise of peace, only to leave behind a trail of destruction, a testament to Naruto's reach. They performed dark rituals, bringing the dead back to life and showing the other villages the full extent of Naruto's power. His name became synonymous with fear. The villages that once looked down upon him now trembled at the mere mention of the harbinger of death. His whispers had spread across the land, like a plague that could not be stopped, a wave of destruction that swept all before it. But fear alone was not enough for Naruto. He desired more than just terror, he sought control, domination over all that existed in the shinobi world. His ambitions reached far beyond the borders of Konoha, beyond the confines of the Forest of Death. He started building something that would be the height of his power, a necropolis, an unholy fortress that would serve as his base of operations and symbol of his reign. The necropolis was to be a city of death, where the living and the dead would coexist under his rule. Dark chakra coursed through the earth as he began his construction. It had not been made of mortar nor stone but out of dark energy, a form of necrotic power which seeped into the earth's very bones. Around this site crackled dark energy when Naruto made his necromancy to raise specters, to summon beast monsters to keep on patrolling on the boundaries, for no one might breach through its walls, as that was now to be the boundaries of his newly formed kingdom. His army of the dead, once a mindless horde, now acted as an extension of his will, moving in perfect harmony as they laid the foundation for his new fortress. Naruto worked tirelessly, pushing his limits to construct the necropolis, a place where the dead would rule over the living. The structure rose from the ground like a black spire, towering over the land as a reminder of his growing power. The walls were lined with the bones of his fallen enemies, their spirits trapped within the stones, their voices echoing in the night. The necropolis would serve as the heart of his empire, a place where he would begin his conquest of the shinobi world. Still, Naruto was not ignorant of the dangers that lurked on the horizon as he continued to grow stronger. The third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, had witnessed too many wars and battles to understand the danger that Naruto posed. For decades, this was the position of wisdom and strength within the Hokage system. Even so, he knew his time was coming to an end. The defeat at the Forest of Death had left Konoha vulnerable, and the village required someone who would match Naruto's dark power. Hiruzen, whose mind was crushed by the heavy burden of the leadership, realized that his time as Hokage was coming to an end. He had followed Naruto from boyhood, he had seen how he fell into darkness, and now he has to face its consequences. Konoha could not afford to lose the war that was coming. Hiruzen had already made up his mind, he would step down, passing the mantle of Hokage to someone who could stand up to the rising storm. His choice was Tsunade Senju, a legendary medical ninja and one of the strongest shinobi to ever live. Tsunade's healing skills in medical jutsu made her the best candidate to balance out Naruto's dark arts. But in so many ways, Tsunade was not somebody in an easy place herself. Heaviness was etched in her heart in so many instances when she lost and filled with regret in the past. Taking this mantle of Hokage would be a great, hard decision for her. Still, Hiruzen hoped she would accept it for the survival of Konoha. Tsunade's Hokage was something of a desperate attempt at reclaiming ground over Naruto. Tsunade took the seat as Hokage and prepared for a war she was sure to fight. She also knew, even with all her strength, it would be very hard to beat Naruto because he had such unprecedented necromantic powers. Every day brought his army of dead closer and closer. Meanwhile, Naruto's plans unfolded. He stood before the gathered ranks of his army, the undead shinobi, spectral beasts, and devoted followers who swore allegiance to him. His once blonde hair now streaked with the pale light of death, glowed with an eerie, otherworldly energy. No longer was he the boy who dreamed of becoming Hokage. He was something more, a being of darkness, an omen of death who would remake the world in his image. He spread his arms out to the heavens, the necropolis rising up behind him as a monument to his power. His voice rose, carrying over the battlefield to the ears of his army and the villages that lay beyond. "The time has come," he said, his voice like deep, rumbling thunder, the words filled with a dark promise. "The world will be consumed by the storm I bring. I will cast down the false gods that sit atop their thrones, and I will make the shinobi world kneel before me. No village will be left unscathed. No life will be left untouched. This is the end, the new beginning. This is the beginning of the new era. This is the age of the bringer of death." The words hung in the air, bearing with them an air of finality. Naruto's storm had already begun. There was no going back now. The shinobi world was going to be burned to a crisp, and from its ashes, Naruto was going to stand as the unconquerable leader. The chapter ended with Naruto standing alone at the front of his army, the weight of his power heavy upon his shoulders. The necropolis loomed behind him, a testament to his growing dominion. The world would tremble before him, and all who opposed him would fall. The storm was coming, and nothing could stop it. With time, the feeling of fear throughout the 5 great shinobi nations grew more intense. Each report from the battlefields, each whisper in the wind, told of Naruto's ascension, his dark power, and his unyielding ambition. Konoha, once a beacon of hope and strength in the shinobi world, had become nothing more than a stepping stone for Naruto's grand design. His army of the dead grew by the day, and his influence began to stretch far beyond the boundaries of the forest of death. The very earth trembled beneath his feet as he forged his path toward domination, and with every victory, his power seemed to multiply. In response to this growing threat, the Five Kage, the leaders of the 5 major shinobi villages, convened for an emergency summit. The stakes could not have been higher. Naruto's necromantic abilities, his army of reanimated shinobi, and his mastery over life and death posed an existential threat to their world. In an age where alliances and old grudges still defined much of the shinobi world, there was no room for hesitation. The Kage knew that the time had come to decide the future of their lands and whether or not to risk everything in the hope of stopping the man who had become a god of death. The summit was held in a neutral location, away from prying eyes and the destructive influence of Naruto's forces. The long sweeping hall was lit dimly by the heavy stone walls, echoing murmurs of the Kage as they took their seats. The tension was thick enough to be grasped. No one had ever faced a challenge like Naruto, and no one had ever been given the opportunity to think of such an enemy powerful, an alien in his world. For all their wisdom, strength, and years of experience, they did not know how to fight this force. The first to speak was Raikage, the head of the Lightning Village. His voice was thunderous, booming within the stone chamber. "This is an affront to everything we stand for. A child, a rogue shinobi, has turned our world into his plaything, and we are supposed to sit idly by and wait? We must act now before he becomes even more powerful." The Tsuchikage grunted in assent. The Raikage is correct, of course. We have watched him cause such destruction in Konoha. Squads of elite shinobi have been eradicated by him. And what of the resurrected corpses he himself raises? It is almost as if he has unraveled the mysteries of life and death themselves. He blasphemes against the very order of nature. He cannot be permitted to continue. Tsunade sat at the table, her face twisted in a blend of exhaustion and frustration. This was the Konoha Hokage, sitting around a table watching her once great village succumb to her own nephew's attacks. Now crippled, unable to do what it once was, she sat there hoping against hope that some other way, some other solution was possible. And all-out war. Deep within, she knew there was no other choice. The battle for Konoha had been lost, and she felt her heart shatter as she realized that the boy she had once hoped would save the world had instead become its biggest nightmare. "I understand your concerns," Tsunade began, her voice as quiet as ever but no softer. "But we can't afford to underestimate him. If we attack him directly, we run the risk of losing everything. His powers, whatever they are, allow him to command death itself. We've already lost men and women who fought hard against him, and his army only grows more numerous." "I am with Tsunade," said the Mizukage, leader of the water village, his voice smooth yet resolute. "We cannot underrate him, but we cannot also afford to jump into a battle that could annihilate us all. We need more information. We need to know his weaknesses before we make our move." The Kage exchanged uneasy glances. The debate had been raging for hours, with each leader arguing their case. The Raikage wanted to strike swiftly, to eradicate Naruto before he could grow too powerful. The Tsuchikage and Mizukage were more cautious, advising careful planning and reconnaissance. But as the debate continued, it became clear that they were all united in one thing: they had no idea how to stop him. His power was too vast, too unpredictable, and they had no clue as to how he had acquired it. "We have been sending our best teams after him, but they never return," Tsunade said, her voice growing heavier with each word. "He has the ability to control the dead, an army that cannot be defeated by traditional means. And I fear that we are facing an enemy who is beyond any of us." The room was silent, the weight of what she said hanging there like some dark cloud. There were no easy answers to be had, no clear path forward. In fact, how could they possibly hope to win with such overwhelming power? Naruto watched over the meeting from the shadows. He had snuck into the summit with his spectral powers, sneaking past the guards, silent and unseen. His mastery of the spirits of the dead granted him the ability to move undetected, his presence little more than a whisper on the wind. From where he was, he could hear every word that was spoken, every plan made. And as he listened, a cold smile crept across his face. The cage had made their decision. They would come for him. It was just a matter of time. They were afraid of him, after all, as they should be. But fear was something to be manipulated, not something that was to be feared. Naruto's hand lay lightly on the hilt of his sword, his mind already planning the next few steps in the play. He knew the summit would be his next target. The cage were the only ones who could stand in his way, and he needed to make them understand the futility of their resistance. The time for subtlety was over. It was time to send them a message they would never forget. Without a sound, Naruto started marking each of the cage with spectral seals. These seals were invisible to the naked eye, but to him, they glowed with an ominous red light, each one binding the cage to his will. These seals would allow him to track them, to sense their movements and actions. And, if necessary, to strike them down from afar. Naruto's lips twisted into a cruel grin as he finished with the final seal. The cage had no idea as to what he had been doing, but soon, they would know all about it. He made each of them his puppets and tied his will to theirs. Be it wherever they may go, he could always find his way back through them. The moment the seals were in place, Naruto stepped out of the summit hall, his form disappearing into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. He would give the cage one last chance to reconsider. Outside the summit hall, the air started to stir. The winds grew stronger, whistling through the trees and carrying with it the scent of death. Clouds overhead grew dark, swirling in an unnatural pattern. It was as if the very sky was answering his call. Naruto raised his hand, and with it, the storm that had been brewing for days erupted in full force. A spectral storm, composed of ethereal winds, dark clouds, and lightning made of pure chakra, descended upon the summit. The sky crackled with energy as the storm raged around the cage's meeting place, the wind howling with a ferocity that seemed to echo the fury in Naruto's heart. From within the tempest, Naruto's voice echoed out low, cold, and menacing. Submit to me, or face annihilation. This world is mine to control. You are nothing but ants beneath my feet. Inside the hall, the cage could feel the power of the storm seeping into the room, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. The air itself seemed to vibrate with Naruto's presence, and for the first time, they felt a deep, gut-wrenching fear. The harbinger of death had arrived, and there would be no escape. The words of Naruto echoed inside their heads. It was an ultimatum, chilling, leaving no room for doubting. They could either submit to his will and bow before him or face the rage of his spectral storm. He knew it was not going to be such an easy choice anyway. It did not matter at the end though, because they had no power to resist him. They were his already. Naruto stood in the distance, against flickering lightning that illuminated a figure, now more silhouette. Still holding the raised hand, he had a mastery over elements now, an absolute dominance over them. Kage can still hear Naruto's faint whisper of voice inside the wind which took his words and brought him this warning for the cages. It marked the start of an end. The wind howled through the lifeless streets of yet another defeated village. Buildings, once vibrant with life, now lay in ruins, their charred remains casting long shadows in the moonlight. The ground was littered with the remnants of broken shinobi, their bodies desecrated and left as a testament to Naruto's power. The village, a small but strategically positioned outpost, had been no match for the unstoppable wave of undead soldiers and shadow constructs that had descended upon it. Naruto stood in the center of the devastation, his eyes cold and calculating as he surveyed the chaos he had wrought. His power had grown exponentially in recent months. Each victory added to his strength, and each enemy he defeated only fueled his unrelenting march toward his goal. His dominion expanded like a creeping shadow, slowly enveloping the land, one village at a time. The undead soldiers, a twisted army of reanimated corpses and shadowy figures, stood obediently at his command, their hollow eyes fixed on their master. There was no hesitation, no fear. Just blind obedience. Every soul he took, every life he claimed, became another link in his chain of power. He had learned much in the past few months. The dark arts of necromancy had become second nature to him, and with every passing day, his mastery over life and death grew more profound. He had discovered ways to bend the souls of his enemies to his will, extracting their very essence and binding them to him through soul-binding seals. The survivors of his conquests were not allowed the luxury of freedom. They were marked, their souls tethered to his, bound to serve him for all eternity. To resist was to be torn apart, to be devoured by the very forces he controlled. As the night wore on, Naruto's forces moved through the ruined village with eerie precision. His undead minions combed the streets, rounding up the survivors. The villagers, broken and defeated, were shackled with the dark seals, their bodies forced into servitude. They were no longer free. They were his. Naruto had no need for pleasantries or mercy. Those who lived by the sword, and died by it, would be reshaped into instruments of his will. The shinobi he captured, once proud warriors, now wore the same dark seals, their bodies twisted into instruments of death, their minds locked in eternal servitude. Naruto's influence was not limited to the small villages. His reach extended beyond the borders of these lands, seeping into the very fabric of the shinobi world. His spies, both living and dead, slipped through the cracks of society, spreading fear and uncertainty wherever they went. Fear was a powerful weapon, one that Naruto wielded with unmatched precision. It tore at the hearts of his enemies, weakening them from within, making them easy prey for his advancing army. Back in Konoha, Tsunade had officially taken the mantle of Hokage. Her appointment had come at a time of unprecedented crisis. The village was reeling from Naruto's attacks, and there was no telling when the next wave would strike. In the wake of her ascension to the position of Hokage, Tsunade wasted no time in organizing a defense. She had always been a fierce leader, a warrior in her own right, and now more than ever, Konoha needed her strength. Tsunade had spent countless hours poring over every scrap of intelligence they had on Naruto. His powers were unlike anything they had ever faced, and the more they uncovered, the more horrifying the reality became. Necromancy, the art of raising the dead, had once been considered a forbidden technique, lost to time. But Naruto had unlocked it, and now he used it to terrorize the world. Tsunade knew that they couldn't rely on traditional strategies to defeat him. They needed something new, something unexpected. Her first course of action was to rally the strongest shinobi in Konoha. Jiraiya, her old comrade and one of the most powerful ninja in the world, had already returned to the village after a long absence. His intelligence network had provided valuable insight into Naruto's movements, but that alone would not be enough. Jiraiya, despite his laid-back demeanor, was a force to be reckoned with when it came to strategy and combat. Kakashi, the copy ninja, was another key player in Tsunade's plans. His Sharingan, though weakened after years of use, was still an invaluable asset. Kakashi had fought alongside Naruto in the past, and his intimate knowledge of Naruto's tactics would be crucial in devising countermeasures. But even Kakashi was beginning to feel the weight of the looming threat. The last time he had faced Naruto, he had barely escaped with his life. This time, he wasn't sure the outcome would be the same. As the days passed, the village worked tirelessly to strengthen its defenses. New jutsu were developed, old techniques refined. The once proud walls of Konoha were reinforced, and the village's defenses were expanded beyond anything it had ever seen. The villagers, however, were not so easily convinced. They feared the worst. Naruto's reputation had spread like wildfire, and there was little faith left in Konoha's ability to defend itself. The fear that had gripped the smaller villages had begun to take root in Konoha as well. But Tsunade refused to let fear rule. She knew that the only way to stop Naruto was to face him head-on. She gathered the leaders of the village, the elders who had seen Konoha through many dark times, and they began planning their final defense. Meanwhile, Naruto continued his march across the land, targeting villages both large and small. His next goal was a particularly rich and prosperous village, one that had long been a thorn in his side. This village had once allied with Konoha, and Naruto had a personal vendetta against its leaders. He had watched as this village had aided Konoha in its efforts to repel his forces, and now he would make them pay. As Naruto's undead forces surrounded the village, he stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching as his army began to advance. His power, the dark forces he controlled, were now almost limitless. His enemies had no idea what was coming. With a single command, the dead would rise, and the village would be theirs. His shadow constructs, twisted beings made from his dark chakra, surged forward like a tidal wave. They were unstoppable, impervious to physical damage, and able to rip through anything in their path. The survivors of the village, if there were any left, would soon find themselves bound by Naruto's soul-binding seals, their lives forever tied to him. Back in Konoha, the tension was palpable. Every shinobi, every citizen, was preparing for the worst. Tsunade had heard reports of Naruto's impending assault on the village, and she knew that the time for planning had passed. The battle was upon them. Tsunade had gathered Jiraiya, Kakashi, and the other top shinobi for a final strategy meeting. Their goal was clear: they had to stop Naruto before he reached the heart of Konoha. But how could they defeat a man who controlled the dead, who wielded unimaginable power over life and death? "We can't let him win," Tsunade said, her voice grim but determined. "We'll use every last resource we have. We will not let him destroy this village." Jiraiya nodded, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a seriousness that Tsunade had rarely seen. "I've got some tricks up my sleeve, but we need a plan. The undead forces he commands are formidable, and I don't know how we can overcome them without risking everything." Kakashi, ever the strategist, furrowed his brow. "I'll lead a small team to the front lines. We can use diversionary tactics to buy time. But ultimately, we'll need something more than just brute force. If we're going to defeat him, we need to break his control over the undead." Tsunade nodded, though doubt lingered in her heart. "We'll try, but I'm not sure we have enough time." As the meeting continued, Naruto's forces grew closer. The undead monstrosity he had created, an abomination formed from the souls of hundreds of shinobi, began to take shape in the heart of his army. This monstrous creature, a combination of flesh and shadow, was a weapon unlike any other. Its form was constantly shifting, its body an amalgamation of broken souls and twisted chakra. It was a symbol of Naruto's ultimate power, a weapon that could destroy entire villages in the blink of an eye. And as Naruto stood atop his dark tower, overseeing his growing army, he could feel the impending clash. Konoha would be his next conquest. He had no doubt about it. But he would give them one final chance to submit. His shadowed throne was within his reach. Only those who knelt before it would survive. The air was laden with the rank smell of smoke, and the booms of drums of war boomed through quiet streets that formerly characterized Konoha. The tall walls that signified the prosperity of the town now crumble under the intensity of Naruto as he relentlessly forces his way with unrelenting force. Dark shadows invaded outskirts of the village along with spectral monsters and dead armies. They moved with an eerie precision, their hollow eyes fixed on their target. Konoha, the heart of the shinobi world, was under siege. And the man leading this destruction, Naruto Uzumaki, now known as the Harbinger of Death, stood at the forefront of it all. Naruto's power had grown beyond anything the village had ever seen. The villagers, already battered from previous skirmishes, did not know how to fight against the supernatural force that Naruto had become. His army of undead soldiers, once villagers, and shinobi he had personally slain or resurrected, now walked the earth as his unwilling servants. His spectral beasts, horrors of shadow and darkness, ripped through the defensive lines with ease. It was as if the earth itself was turning against Konoha, bleeding life to fuel Naruto's growing strength. The massive gates of Konoha had been shattered in mere moments, leaving a path wide open for the oncoming army. The village's defenders, caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault, fought valiantly but were overwhelmed. Tsunade stood at the front, rallying the last remnants of the forces, her hands drenched in blood from the endless battles. She knew this day was coming. She had felt it in her bones, the inevitable clash with Naruto. But now, standing in the middle of the battlefield, watching as the walls crumbled and her comrades were killed, she realized the full depth of Naruto's power. He was no longer that innocent child she had once known. He was something much worse now, a force of annihilation that nothing could stop. Tsunade. Shizen called out, hurrying to her side, "We have to pull back. We can't keep them off our backs." Tsunade shook her head. Her eyes seemed to steal over with determination. "We fight. We do not retreat." But even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of Naruto's power pressing down on her. The earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse with dark chakra, each step she took drained her energy. Her gaze flickered toward the horizon, where Naruto's figure could be seen, a silhouette against the firestorm of battle. He was there, overseeing the destruction he had wrought. The ground cracked open, and up from the bowels of the earth, massive skeletal hands shot up, each pulling along the reanimated corpses of fallen Konoha soldiers. Tsunade's heart sank as she recognized the faces of her old comrades, friends who had long since been gone, now mindless puppets under Naruto's control. Their eyes, filled with life, were now dull and vacant, devoid of any will to struggle or hold out. The very thought of fighting against them caused a wave of nausea to pass over Tsunade. However, she had no alternative. The battle still raged, and survival at Konoha rested in the hands of how well they could fight through this horror. "Shizen," Tsunade barked. "Protect the civilians. Get them to the safe zones." Shizen nodded hurriedly and darted off to carry out the order, but Tsunade's eyes stayed on the battlefield. She'd always been one to take pride in her strength, but here, facing the ceaseless tide of death that Naruto had unleashed, she felt crushed by hopelessness. Meanwhile, within the heart of the battlefield, Jiraiya joined the fray. His presence alone was a beacon of hope for the villagers, but even his huge strength seemed insignificant against the enormous power of Naruto's forces. He fought side by side with Kakashi and other top shinobi of Konoha, desperately fighting to hold back the tide of darkness. "Damn it, Naruto!" Jiraiya cursed under his breath, smashing his fist into the chest of a reanimated shinobi. The force of the blow sent the corpse flying, but there were always more. "What the hell happened to you?" It was as if answering his unspoken question, when Naruto appeared before him, stepping through the smoke like a ghost from the past. His face was cold, his eyes not holding the warmth they once had. He was no longer that brash, determined boy that Jiraiya had mentored. This new Naruto was something else altogether. The scars of his pain had been replaced by something darker, a burning rage that fueled every action. "Jiraiya," Naruto said in low, mocking tones. "You still wanted to stop him." Jiraiya's heart twisted in anguish at the view of his former pupil. He had seen how Naruto had slid into darkness, but he never thought it would be this way. The boy he had trained had become a monster. Part of him wanted to reach out to him and try to drag Naruto back from the abyss. But he knew there was nothing left to save. The darkness had consumed him. "You don't have to do this, Naruto," Jiraiya implored, his voice cracking with emotion. "You are still my student. I know there is a part of you that remembers who you were. You can't let this power control you." Naruto's lips curled into a cruel smile. "There's nothing left of that boy, Jiraiya. He died the moment Konoha turned its back on me. I'm beyond redemption now." He couldn't even raise a hand when Naruto raised one. The wave of necrotic energy shot out, slamming him with the power of 1,000 punches. The old sage was knocked back, and his body went crashing into the building next door. He managed to get to his feet and coughed out blood, the pain overwhelming him. "I've long surpassed you," Naruto said, his voice cold and detached. "You're weak, Jiraiya. And you always were." Jiraiya rose to his feet, his eyes burning with determination. "Perhaps. But I won't let you destroy everything we fought for. I won't let you turn Konoha into your kingdom of death." Naruto's eyes narrowed, and in an instant, he was upon Jiraiya, his spectral chains wrapping around Jiraiya's arms, rendering him immobile. "You're a fool. The world I'm creating will be far greater than any village or Hokage. You can't stop me. None of you can." With one final brutal motion, Naruto launched all his force and sent Jiraiya flying all over the battlefield. Still seeing his blurry vision because of pain, he saw Naruto standing over him. There was no benevolence in Naruto's eyes, only the cold and emotionless look of a victor. "Retreat." The blood-stained lips in which Jiraiya mouthed were audible. "Get out now while you still can." Naruto's eyes flashed to the retreating shinobi, then back to Jiraiya. His face did not change. "I'll take care of you later." Jiraiya, badly hurt, ran away, but his victory was a sour one. Naruto's power was too great to fight in an open battle. But as Jiraiya stumbled back into the heart of Konoha, he knew the fight was far from over. However, in the Konoha side of things, matters worsened instead. The deep earth under Konoha, where Naruto placed the seals that gave off a deadly pulse with evil power. Land is slowly withered out, and water from the rivers was all taken to be the power that drives Naruto's force. The soil from beneath the tree to beneath the feet, they all have a way out by just letting life disappear for what's to stay. Tsunade stood at the edge of the battlefield, her heart heavy with the weight of the village's impending fall. She knew that Konoha would not survive this attack unless they received help. Desperation clawed at her as she turned to the remaining shinobi. "We need reinforcements," she said urgently. "The other villages must help us, or Konoha will fall." Her words were met with grim silence. Even the strongest shinobi were beginning to falter. But Tsunade's resolve remained unbroken. She would not allow Naruto to destroy everything they had worked for. "We'll send out messengers to the other villages," she said, her voice firm. "We need their help now, or it's all over." But as the words left her mouth, a terrible rumble shook the earth. The necrotic seals planted by Naruto began to pulse more violently, and a massive undead monstrosity, fused with the souls of hundreds of fallen shinobi, emerged from the ground. Its form was a grotesque, writhing mass of flesh and bone, a horrifying testament to Naruto's power. It let out a deafening roar, signaling the beginning of the final assault. Tsunade looked up, her face grim. The real battle is just about to start. And with that, the Siege of Shadows really began. Sun set, but still there lingered on about some weirdly vivid red. From Konoha ruins, there's not even strength or unity within that could say that a glorious day like it would happen there. As all these ash-laden smoky smoke is just hanging up at the top as well, going out of and off all once thriving homes and what was against a smoky ruin in front. In streets strewn with cadavers, each still warm, some while the cold others. The air was heavy with the smell of death and rot, signs of a civilization on the brink of annihilation. The forces of Naruto continued to sweep through the village, leaving no one untouched. The relentless army had overwhelmed the defenses of Konoha. The ground shook with each step the monsters took, and the light of the village's once glorious heart was dying out with every passing minute. Survivors were few, huddled in small groups behind whatever few fortifications were left or in the shadows. But it was a pointless endeavor. No one could have escaped the inevitable. No matter where they went, Naruto's army was always there, persistent, unrelenting. Tsunade stood at the side of the Hokage monument. Her eyes searched the wasteland below. She had seen that view so many times in childhood and in leading. And now, somehow it felt alien to her. Where children had once played on streets were empty, desolate places. The training grounds where the next generation of shinobi had honed their skills had become graves. And the Hokage monument, the proud symbol of the village's legacy, now stood in the shadow of a new, terrible king. Naruto. Her student. Her former apprentice. He had become something else entirely, a creature of darkness and death. It was hard to think that the boy she had grown up watching as he became a young man would fall so hard. She fought so hard for him, had guided him as best she knew how, yet now she found herself standing on the precipice and looking down into the abyss. She had been aware for quite some time now that this fight was coming her way, but never had she imagined it could be so merciless, so annihilating. "You fought well, Tsunade," a voice called out from behind her, breaking her thoughts. She turned to find Jiraiya standing there, his face as grim as hers. "It doesn't matter, Jiraiya," Tsunade replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We've lost." Jiraiya clenched his fists, frustration and sorrow written on his face. "We haven't lost yet," he said, his voice strong but tinged with doubt. "There's still a chance. If we can just hold out long enough, the other villages might send reinforcements." Tsunade shook her head, looking out over the village once more. "There's no hope left. Konoha is dead. I'm the last Hokage." "No," Jiraiya said fiercely, stepping closer. "You are not the last Hokage. Not as long as there is still breath in your body." She silently gazed downwards at the engulfing flames which consumed the entire village. Thoughts were racing but no solutions in her mind, for people once fighting for peace were now rebels. With Naruto's ascendancy, death had befallen the dreams of a new world. And in his turn, he turned into the enemy he had earlier fought against and tore apart all that they have built. Dark energy burst through the air in a ruffle, shaking the earth under their feet. Tsunade's heart clenched, recognizing the source of the power she felt. She didn't need to look up to know what it was. Naruto has arrived. Suddenly out of the monument's edge, Naruto appears, shrouded in an aura of death and shadow. The moonlight glistened off his form, outlining him in an almost otherworldly glow. His eyes were cold and distant, scanning down at the wreckage below, taking in each moment of Konoha's destruction. In this moment, Tsunade realized how far Naruto had been cast down. The man she once knew, who yearned for justice and recognition, was now an embodiment of destruction itself. "Naruto," Tsunade said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Naruto's lips curled into a cruel smile, but it was not the smile of the boy she had known. It was the smile of a conqueror. "I'm not doing this for you, Tsunade. I'm doing this because it's necessary. Konoha has had its time. Now it's my turn. I've ascended beyond your petty notions of peace. I am the Death King now." Tsunade clenched her fists, her chakra bursting forth as she readied herself for the final battle. "I won't let you destroy everything we've worked towards. I won't allow you to transform this world into your kingdom of death." Naruto's face set in a frown and he took a step forward. "You don't have a choice, Tsunade. This is something that is inevitable." With a mere flick of his wrist, Naruto summoned a wave of necrotic energy to surge toward Tsunade. She barely avoided it, but the blast ripped through the monument behind her, sending debris crashing to the ground. Tsunade gritted her teeth, feeling her body ache from the power she had barely avoided. It was over. This was what she had been dreading all along. Naruto was too powerful. She wouldn't win. However, Tsunade wasn't lonely for long. Behind her stood a voice and, "Tsunade, get away." Sakura walked out of the shadows, still intent on catching Naruto. The girl had determined expression on her face, cradling one scroll tightly between her fingers. "I have the technique. That sealing technique by which we may catch him, so we would stop him as well." Tsunade looked at her, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Sakura, you can't. I have to try. Sakura cut in, her voice steady. She unrolled the scroll, whispering an incantation under her breath. Chakras started swirling around her hands, and a bright light began shining from the seal. She slapped the scroll on the ground, and a powerful barrier erupted from it, encircling Naruto. The seal started glowing brightly, its power beginning to take hold. The surprise flickered in Naruto's expression for a fraction of a moment before his mouth widened in a rage. What is this? He screamed. Sakura's eyes sparkled with hope as the seal pulled him toward the center. It's over, Naruto. This seal is bound to trap you. You cannot break free. But Naruto's lips twisted into a wicked smile, and in an instant, the air around him turned cold. You think you can seal me? You think this pathetic technique can stop me? With a horrific jolt of power, Naruto's link to the Shinigami blazed. The shadows around him grew darker, and in a moment, he broke the seal, the barrier cracking and falling apart in a flash of light. Sakura took a step back, her knees giving way as the power faded from her. Tsunade's heart fell. It was done. All that she had held onto for so long was now reduced to dust. Naruto's laughter echoed through the ruins, cold and cruel. You really thought you could defeat me with a mere sealing technique? I am beyond your reach. I am the Death King. Tsunade slumped her shoulders, but she never gave up. She knew the darkness that had laced in Naruto's eyes, she refused to believe there was no way back for him. Naruto, she whispered, this isn't you. This isn't the path you should take. Naruto's eyes narrowed. It's too late for that, Tsunade. You've lost. He raised his hand, and a wave of dark energy rippled outward. The ground beneath them cracked open, releasing torrents of necrotic energy. The sky above Konoha turned black, as if the very heavens themselves had abandoned the village. Tsunade and Sakura barely managed to hold their ground as Naruto's power overwhelmed them. There was nothing left to fight for. Nothing left to hope for. As Konoha burned and crumbled around him, Naruto stood victorious, silhouetted by the fire in his black figure. He wasn't that boy anymore. Much worse than he ever was. He was the Death King. The necropolis stood as testament to the brutality that had become Naruto's empire. Where once Konoha had been a thriving village of hope and resilience, it now sprawled like a twisted monument to the dead. The buildings, black and dead now, reached for the sky in jagged forms, walls once bright and clean now cracked with openings for some form of crepuscular blackness that pulsed with an energy all its own. The streets were so silent that nothing broke the stillness except the scuttling of the dead and the faint wail of the wind between the hollow remains of what was once a proud village. Naruto was finally transformed. He had lost the remnants of the boy he once was, the hopeful shinobi who dreamed of becoming Hokage, and now he stood as the Death King, ruler of the necropolis. His power had reached unimaginable heights, his control over death absolute. He no longer had to raise a hand to command his undead legions, rather, his mere presence was sufficient to keep them in line since their loyalty had been cemented by the soul-binding seals that he had put upon them. The surviving members of Konoha, now mostly less than half who managed to escape the first wave, were his slaves. They had been bound to servitude in reconstruction of his kingdom or as food for the continuously proliferating army of dead. They toiled under the watchful eyes of Naruto's reanimated soldiers, bound to guard the borders of the necropolis, to ensure no one escaped. Naruto stood at the center of his dark capital, looking out over the desolate wasteland that had once been home to so many. The wind whispered through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of decay, and Naruto couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction. This was his world now, a world built on the foundation of fear and death. Konoha had fallen, and with it, the last remnant of the old order. But the sweetness of victory tasted bitter. Memories of the old days came back, when he used to crave acknowledgement, acceptance, and when the burning fire within his heart for the protection of his friends still glowed in his heart. He saw faces of his former comrades before his eyes: Sasuke, Sakura, Kakashi, Jiraiya, each of them now just a memory, haunting his mind as a ghost. He had done what he had to do. He had broken free from the shackles of the past, but in doing so, he had lost everything he had once held dear. A flicker of doubt gnawed at him, but it was fleeting. The power he had gained was intoxicating, and he had no intention of letting it slip away. He had a new goal now. Konoha was just the beginning. He would conquer the entire shinobi world, crushing any who dared oppose him underfoot. And with the power of the Shinigami coursing through him, there was nothing that could stand in his way. This line of thought, however, was interrupted by Orochimaru, his trusted lieutenant. That rogue ninja whom he had conquered now bowed so low that almost touched the floor. "Lord Naruto," slithered the voice of the former rogue, "the last preparations are finally all set. Necropolis is full on established. All the borders have been secured with the ready-to-deploy force awaiting the succeeding plan for domination." Naruto nodded, his face expressionless. "Good. It's time to move forward." He turned away from the battlefield. His dark cloak swirled around him like a dark entity as he walks toward the center of the necropolis, his throne now taken. His throne of power. As he takes his seat upon it, weight of his ruling settled over his shoulders, yet Naruto did not flinch. For, after all, this was his fate. He had decided, and it was now left to be acted out. The other Kage, ones who had, at one time, been adversaries, were hiding in the shadows, gathering and preparing for this final stand. The alliance formed between the other villages was as fragile as their survival depended upon each other to live. After all, when they had once had the chance to get rid of the boy, Naruto, they still failed. Now there was no escape but to turn against him altogether. In the shadows of their alliance, a plan was taking shape. The Kage had discovered an ancient artifact, long hidden in the depths of history, one that could weaken the power of the Shinigami and, in turn, Naruto's control over death itself. This artifact was said to hold a power which would sever the link between Death King and this world of living. However, this came with a price. It could be used only by someone who has no connection to the world of death, or at least not connected to what is dark and eating Naruto alive at this point. The person was none other than Hinata Hyuga. Once Hinata had been Naruto's best friend, his confidant, the girl who had always believed in him, even when no one else did. She had a deep connection with him and never stopped caring for him, even as he descended further into darkness. The Kage knew that she was their best hope, the one person who might be able to reach Naruto before it was too late. But Hinata was no fool. She knew how grave the situation was, and she knew the risks. To confront Naruto now was to face not only her old friend but the very darkness that had consumed him. She had seen with her own eyes the horrors of the necropolis, the armies of the undead marching across the land, and the once proud village now reduced to a hellish landscape. She had seen how the boy whom she once loved had become a merciless tyrant. But all this notwithstanding, she could not give up on him. She could not allow Naruto's soul to be lost forever. So, with a heavy heart, Hinata set out for the necropolis, armed with the artifact and a resolve stronger than any she had ever known. She would penetrate the innermost heart of Naruto's empire, locate him, and if she could succeed and save him from the well into which he had fallen. But she realized that it wasn't going to be an easy task. For Naruto was not the same one he had ever been, thus, she entered the very core of his power. The journey to the necropolis was long and perilous, but Hinata was determined. She used the full extent of her training, blending into the shadows and using her Byakugan to navigate through the ruined lands. The closer she got to the necropolis, the heavier the air became, thick with the weight of death. She could feel the oppressive energy radiating from the center of the city, and it only made her resolve harder. Finally, she reached the edge of the necropolis, her heart thumping in her chest as she gazed on the monstrous structure that now was Naruto's throne. It was a place of death, where hope had been long extinguished. Yet, in the depth of her soul, Hinata still felt something that told her that Naruto was still in there, somewhere, beneath the layers of darkness that had overtaken him. She took a deep breath and stepped out into the room. She had her heart set on finding Naruto. She needed to try no matter what, for the darkness he had become would not keep her from him. The silence around her was deafening as she delved deeper into the necropolis. The streets were empty, the air thick with the stench of decay. And then, she felt a presence, cold and familiar. She didn't need to see him to know he was there. Naruto. He had been waiting for her. Hinata walked into the very heart of the necropolis. There, standing behind her with his back turned to her, stood Naruto over the dark city he had built. His cloak fluttered about him in the wind, and a soft, eerie light clung to him. For a moment, there was nothing between them, an uncomfortable, oppressive silence. Naruto, Hinata called softly, her voice quivering but steady. It's me. Hinata. Naruto slowly turned to her, his cold, emotionless eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, perhaps. But it was fleeting, and quickly replaced by the cold indifference he now wore like a mask. Hinata, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I wondered when you would come. You always were too soft. Hinata's heart ached as she looked at him, but she refused to let her emotions overwhelm her. I haven't come to fight you, Naruto. I've come to save you. Naruto's lips curled into a twisted smile. Save me? From what? From my power? From the peace I'd brought to the world. Hinata shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. You've lost yourself, Naruto. This isn't the way. I can't just stand by and watch you destroy everything. Naruto's face turned darker. You're too late, Hinata. There is no going back now. I've chosen my path. Hinata stepped forward, holding the artifact out in front of her. I don't believe that. You're still in there, Naruto. I know you are. Something flickered in Naruto's eyes, some glimmer of the boy he used to be, but it vanished and was followed by bitter laughter. You really believe that some charm will change me? You really are as silly as ever. Hinata clutched the artifact tied in her hand. I'm not giving up on you, Naruto. I'll fight for you, no matter how badly you forget who you used to be. And with this, the war for Naruto's soul started. The necropolis was silent, quiet like Hinata's steps as she passed through every shadow telling its threats. Absolute silence surrounded her, each of her strides seemed to reverberate in the air, reminding her that, beneath her feet, the very ground itself was imbued with that deathly power that Naruto had made. The city was vast, its dark spires stretching high into a sky veiled with swirling mist, a constant reminder of the dark forces at work here. It had once been Konoha, her home, but now, it had been transformed into a twisted reflection of what it once was, a kingdom of the dead under the rule of the man she had once loved. She held within her, an artifact she'd been given by the cage to hold onto, of ancient relic. The power of hope that lay in this artifact remained untapped. She didn't know if this would sever Naruto from the Shinigami, nor if it would weaken him enough to stop him. But what she knew for sure was that she could not turn back. Konoha, and indeed the world at large, waited for her to succeed. And yet, Naruto, the ache in her chest seemed to intensify at the thought of him. She remembered that boy who had wanted to be Hokage, the boy who had reached out to others even as the darkness closed in on him. But now, there was no trace of that boy in the face of the man who ruled the necropolis. There was only the Death King, a creature whose existence was entwined with the very fabric of the afterlife, a godlike being whose power had surpassed anything the shinobi world had ever known. Hinata's Byakugan scanned the path ahead, her senses acute as she noticed the movements of the undead sentries guarding the perimeter of the throne room. They were not entirely alive, not in the traditional sense. These soldiers were mere shadows of their former selves, controlled by Naruto's will. Yet, Despite their hollow existence, they were formidable. Any misstep would alert them to her presence. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She used the artifact for guidance, the relic pulsing softly in her hand, as if it recognized her purpose. It hummed with an energy she did not fully understand but trusted nonetheless. The path was treacherous, winding through narrow hallways and chambers filled with arcane symbols and necrotic energy. The walls themselves pulsed with the dark power Naruto had absorbed, making every step a reminder of the stakes. She could feel the weight of every breath, the pressure mounting as she grew closer to her destination. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she reached the central chamber, the throne room. The doors loomed large before her, the once ornate wood now blackened and scorched, as though it had been exposed to some burning force that would never relent. The heavy air pushed against her chest, and Hinata's heart pounded in her ears. She hesitated for only a moment before she pushed the doors open. The room was vast, darkened, and only lit by the faintest glow of torches along the walls. The air was heavy with a presence she could not define. There, at the far end of the room, sat Naruto. His silhouette was shrouded in shadows, but there was no mistaking the presence of the Death King. His fiery hair had darkened, now streaked with silver, and his eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. His form radiated a power so immense that it almost crushed the air around him. "Naruto," Hinata whispered, stepping forward. His eyes met hers, cold and unfeeling. For a moment, there was a flicker of something that looked like recognition, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the overwhelming aura of the being he had become. Naruto's lips curled into a twisted smile, but there was no warmth in it, no trace of the boy she had known. "So, you came after all. I expected no less." Her chest felt tight as she looked at him. He wasn't the man she had admired once. Darkness had consumed him. But inside him, there was still something that hadn't completely disappeared. She believed that with all her heart. "Why, Naruto?" she asked, voice trembling. "Why have you done this? This isn't the way." Naruto rose from his throne, his movement fluid and unsettling, like a specter rising out of the depth of nightmare. He stood taller now, more imposing, with an aura that radiated overpowering power. It was obvious that Shinigami influence had changed him, merged him into something greater than human, even beyond the bounds of God. He stood before her, but his eyes, no longer that warm, friendly brown, seemed now a glowing, ghostly violet shade and spoke of death, of an endless void, of an eternity without compassion. "I have done what needed to be done, Hinata," Naruto replied, his voice cold and without emotion. "The world needed to be freed from its shackles, and I was the one who had to do it. The village, the people, they all failed me. They abandoned me, just like everyone else. I am beyond their petty ideals now." Hinata's heart ached as she listened. She knew the pain that had driven him, the years of loneliness, the betrayal. But this wasn't the answer. The Naruto she had once known would never have chosen this path. He would never have become this twisted version of himself. "You can still change, Naruto," she pleaded. "Please, you don't have to be like this." A low, mocking chuckle escaped his lips. "Change? You're as naive as ever," he said. "I have become something much greater than you can conceive. I am now a god, Hinata. The Shinigami's power runs through my veins. I rule over death itself. There is no going back." Hinata could feel the weight of the words, the crushing finality that lay behind. He had embraced his power so fully that there was no place for her, no place for the Naruto she had known. And yet, in the depths of his eyes, there was something fragile, something she couldn't quite grasp. It was as if he was teetering on the edge of something, a precipice between the man he had been and the monster he had become. "Don't you see?" Hinata whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not a god, Naruto. You're still human. You still have a heart. I can feel it. I know you're still in there. For a second, Naruto's eyes flickered. A small moment of hesitation passed through him. It was enough to give Hinata hope for a brief moment. She knew the man she once knew was still there, buried under the layers of darkness he'd surrounded himself with. He couldn't be lost. But that was not to be. Naruto's face set hard, and coldness returned in his eyes with an intensity beyond ever. That's enough, Hinata. I don't need your pity. I'm beyond redemption. Hinata's heart broke as she saw the one she loved, the one she had once believed in, throw everything she had ever hoped for away. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. She had come too far to turn back now. She raised the artifact without warning, the ancient relic glowing with a soft, golden light. Naruto's eyes narrowed, his expression turning to one of cold amusement. You think this little bauble can stop me? He sneered. Naruto moved with terrifying speed, hand outstretched before Hinata had a chance to talk. He slammed it into her chest, sending her flying backward with a force that left her gasping for air. She let the artifact slip from her fingers as she hit the ground. Pain ricocheted through her body. For a moment, the world spun around her, the room blurring in and out of focus. She could barely catch her breath, the taste of blood filling her mouth. But she forced herself to stand, to fight. Naruto, she gasped, struggling to rise. Please, there's still time. Naruto stepped forward, his gaze piercing as he approached her. You're weak, Hinata. I've moved past weakness. He raised his hand again, and this time he had no pause. The darkness that surrounded him now curled in upon itself, waiting to unleash. But that's when it changed. Naruto paused. His hand, suspended in midair, trembled. His eyes flickered once more, a flash of something, doubt, regret, passing through them. It was brief, but it was enough. Enough for Hinata to see that the man she had once known was still there, buried deep within the monstrous shell he had become. It was enough to give her the strength to act. She reached out with the last vestiges of energy left within her and again gripped the relic. She kept a firm grip this time and centered her concentration on the energy in it. The relic vibrated and surged power to strike out across the room into the gap between herself and Naruto. Naruto backed off, his face distorted with both anger and bewilderment. What's happening? Hinata didn't answer. She simply held the artifact up, willing it to do what she couldn't. The power surged between them, and for a moment, Naruto's dark energy wavered. It was as if the Shinigami's grip on him had weakened, just enough for Hinata to see the cracks. However, Naruto was not through yet. With a frustrated growl, he punched in, his hand around her throat that could crush granite. Deep in the throat, Hinata gasped for air, and her vision turned pitch black. You shouldn't have interfered, Hinata, Naruto's low voice tinged with icy resolution. Now, you're going to be a prisoner of my power. With that, he slammed her to the ground, chains of darkness materializing around her, binding her wrists and ankles. She saw his face before the darkness took over. It was a split between the man he had been and the monster he had become. The air around the necropolis vibrated, the very earth beneath the feet of the approaching allied shinobi forces vibrating with ominous energy that flowed from the ruins of what had once been Konoha. Wind howled through broken streets, stirring ash and dust marking the former heart of the shinobi world. The din of battle rang through the air, but the further they delved into the city, the more unearthly the silence grew. The last attack's leaders, the Kage, stood at the vanguard of the final charge. Their determination was unshakable, but the burdens of the mission weighed heavily. They fought not just for survival but for the soul of the world, for the hope that had almost disappeared with the despotism of Naruto. Their joined forces of people village survivors, big and small, made up the last stronghold against the necropolis, and yet they could feel death choking them alive. Tsunade, the Hokage of 5th generation, held her clenched fists with her lips pursed together in an intense determination and misery. She once was the village leader of whom Naruto destroyed everything, and whatever she has gone through throughout her years, nothing will ever be more devastating than looking at this ruinous city Konoha, gone. The people she had sworn to protect were either dead or enslaved, and the boy she had once known had become something beyond even her comprehension. Beside her, Gaara, the Kage, stared with unflinching eyes at the city's dark spires. He had fought Naruto once before, but that had been a different Naruto. A boy with dreams. A man now no, a monster who wielded the power of death itself. Gaara-san stirred restlessly around him, sensing the unease in its master's heart. The bond they had shared during the Chunin exams, the moments when they fought alongside one another, seemed to be a long time ago. Now, Gaara was no longer that boy, neither was Naruto. "Prepare yourselves," Tsunade said softly, her voice firm but carrying the burden of the world. "We may not have another chance." They had prepared for this moment. Forbidden techniques, anti-necromancy seals, and chakra-disrupting methods. Each one of their weapons had been put on display, and all of them knew this was it, their final stand. Yet even as they prepared to breach the heart of Naruto's dark fortress, the sense of inevitability loomed over them. How could they fight something so vast, so powerful? Naruto had become more than just a man, he was now a force, a being of unimaginable power, and to defeat him seemed impossible. "Let's make sure we don't go down without a fight," Gaara said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos they were about to unleash. The first wave hit. It was as if the earth itself was alive, trembling beneath their feet as the dead began to rise from the ground, summoned from the depths of the necropolis. These weren't just simple undead soldiers. They were warriors, ninjas of past generations, their bodies broken and pieced together by Naruto's dark power. As they rise up, their eyes burn with an unearthly glow and their arms clash with weapons that are not just physical but are also imbued with chakra, tainted by the very energy that had corrupted the land. With a roar, the Kage led the charge. Tsunade's fists flew, smashing through the undead with incredible strength, but even she could feel the toll it was taking on her body. Each blow sent shockwaves through her, and for every undead she felled, 3 more seemed to rise in its place. Her chakra, already strained from years of battle, was beginning to waver. Gaara-san danced around him, cut through the undead, and shielded his friends. But he could feel the imbalances in the fight, people too many, and the tide was turning in his favor. They were fighting a battle with no easy victory, merely a battle of brute strength and muscle mass. Then, ghostly beasts appeared. From the dark, damp corners of the necropolis, monstrous shapes began to pour forth, creatures not even of flesh and blood but chakra and death itself. Twisted fruit from Naruto's unnatural merging of the Shinigami powers with his chakra, the beasts were shadowy, impossibly large entities with gaping jaws and claws strong enough to shred anything in their way. They thundered forward with a roar as the earth quaked beneath them. One of them, a gargantuan creature that seemed to be part dragon, part serpent, eclipsed the sun as it towered over the battlefield. Tsunade barely managed to dodge the swipe of its claws, the force sending her flying through the air and crashing into the ground with a resounding thud. The pain was instant, her body protesting, but there was no time to rest. The war was taking place, the world hanging within the balance and the sands which Gaara stood on. The sand began its movement to keep Tsunade safe from view, but she was unable to avoid the wide swing of a beast's tail that swung wide and sent it crashing into broken debris from another ruined building. His sand swirled and wrapped around him now, trying once more to ward off the doom that crashed within. "Hold it together," Tsunade bellowed across the battlefield. "We cannot let them push us back that far." In the gloomiest of moments, there was a blast of white light on the horizon. Hinata, battered but unyielding, emerged at the edge of the battle, the piece she had stolen from the necropolis glowing dully in her palms. She had gotten free of Naruto's grip, but her way was not without danger. The chains had been hard to break, and the undead guardians almost caught her a few times. But now, here she was, and she had a plan if only she could execute it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she used the artifact to break through the barrier surrounding Naruto's domain. The seals that had been put upon the city, the very bonds that restrained the undead to their master, were now weakened, but she did not have much time to use that. She concentrated, and her Byakugan came online as she poured her chakra into the relic, channeling it into the central heart of the necropolis. The seals binding Naruto's power to the Shinigami were intricate, but she had memorized the pattern. It wasn't perfect, but it was their only shot. Just a little longer, she whispered to herself. The Kage were fighting hard to keep their ground. Tsunade and Gaara were the last of their forces that were still fighting, their bodies battered and their chakra reserves nearly depleted. The undead kept coming, the monstrous beasts continued their rampage, and yet, the Kage stood tall, refusing to yield. But then, as battle raged on, something was different. Ground beneath them quaked once again, but it wasn't those creatures coming to get them, it was Naruto. Naruto appeared, from the heart of the necropolis, casting a long shadow over the battlefield. He was no longer man but a being of pure, incomprehensible power, the Death King himself. He moved with ease through the fray, tearing through the allied shinobi forces with ease, his eyes glowing with an intensity that was both terrifying and divine. There was no one left who could stand against him. But no one said Tsunade fought easily, her forceful attacks did, however, wear away. Tsunade was crushing mountains just once with fist before, nowadays those very fists smacked nothing in emptiness. Similarly, sand under Gaara faltered, unable to cope even more with mass killings of corpses, an unbearable assault that was created from Naruto power. The struggle for them all seemed to slowly recede through hands. Naruto's voice was low and laced with mocking, and reached them as he came closer. You were all so certain you could stop me. But look around you. The world is mine now. Your time is over. He threw Tsunade into the ground with a flick of his wrist, her body crumbling like a doll. Gaara's sand was torn apart as Naruto approached, and the Kaze Kage was thrown to the side like a rag doll. But he wasn't done yet. Not until he had absorbed their chakra and sealed their fates. In a final, desperate push, Naruto stretched out his fingers, where they touched Tsunade's and Gaara's forms, draining their chakra with a ferocity that left them gasping to catch their breaths. The power streaming into him filled him with even greater solidity towards the label of invincibility, which was what the Kage had given their all. Standing amidst the carnage, Naruto looked down at the fallen leaders of the shinobi world, their forms barely recognizable, their energy consumed by his own. He was now more powerful than ever, a godlike being who controlled life and death itself. No one could stand against him. The world is mine, Naruto declared, his voice resonating with the finality of his victory. And no one will ever stop me again. But deep inside, beneath the layers of power and darkness, something stirred, a faint flicker of doubt, a shadow of the boy he had once been. For a moment, it was there, barely perceptible. But then, it was gone, buried beneath the weight of the Death King's reign. The world had fallen to his hands, and the last hope of the shinobi world had died. Long past had the sky above the necropolis darkened, its pale light bathing the shattered city in an otherworldly glow. All that was left of the proud hidden leaf village was the ruin it lay in, nothing more than a graveyard for dreams that died alongside it. It had marked a new beginning, the one where Naruto stood as its god, ruler, and destroyer. Long since having given up all hope for human recognition, he now basked in the strength of the force that reigned over humanity as a Death King, a strength far superior to those who had ravaged before. His form was shrouded by the dark energy on top of the wreckage of the Hokage monument. His bond with the Shinigami had merged fully with his body, and he was more than a man. He was a god, a being whose very presence twisted the fabric of reality itself. The ground beneath him cracked and splintered, shadows crawling out from the depths of the earth, as if the world itself feared the power he now commanded. Time and space bent unnaturally, as if the laws of nature had been rewritten in his image. Now his eyes shone, once with youthful spark and ambitious fire, like an otherworldly glow, proof of that Shinigami soul that consumed his long before. There wasn't a smidgen of the Naruto that had dreamed to be Hokage, to defend the village which had scorned him. Now there was just the Death King erasing existence into nothingness merely by thinking so. He closed his eyes, and this time he didn't feel this half-emptiness. This was the totality of his power, coursing through him like lightning. He had gone past his fragile human vessel, became a vehicle for the will of Shinigami. Now, the world was his playground in which to paint his twisted version. The shadows came alive to whisper to him. He listened, voicing back as he molded them into warping the world around him. But even in this ultimate moment of power, there was something moving inside him. A memory, dim and transient, of the world before, bonds, hope, love. A feeling he could no longer grasp, a vestige of the past that clung to him as he clung to the darkness. He cast it aside, pushing it into the recesses of his mind, focusing instead on the destruction that lay ahead. The world would kneel before him, and nothing would stand in his way. Yet, as the world twisted and reshaped itself beneath his influence, there was one person who still dared to stand against him. Hinata. The once innocent girl, who had loved him so much, who had for a time seen the boy within the monster, she now stood at the edge of the battlefield, holding the ancient artifact that had been entrusted to her by the remaining Kage, one thing that possibly could weaken Naruto's godlike form. It was her last hope and theirs. Hinata had had hell to get there. She had fled her village, in the end forced to watch while her world crumbled into embers after his first betrayal, the fall of Konoha, and spent years hiding out, living her life in shadows because she couldn't turn her back on the man she had loved. She had followed scraps of the Shinobi Alliance from one fight for survival to another, gathering remaining bits of hope, when finally, after everything was broken and hopeless, there existed an artifact, an unparalleled weapon strong enough to disconnect the bond connecting Naruto and Shinigami just for an instant. And that is where he now stood again, across from her. Naruto's cold gaze fell across her, his expression unreadable, but there flashed beneath the mask of divine indifference he wore a flicker of something, perhaps recognition. Hinata caught her breath and stepped forward, opening her Byakugan, her unwavering glance piercing though the overwhelming pressure that radiated from Naruto. Hinata, Naruto's voice rumbled, a low, unnerving sound that seemed to rattle the very air around him. You still won't listen. You still hold onto the past for something that don't exist anymore. Your world is destroyed. Everything you know is all gone. Here is no home for you anymore. Hinata held the artifact before her, its ancient power humming in her hands. She felt the weight of it, the responsibility it carried. This was their last chance, the only weapon that might bring Naruto back to himself, or at least sever the connection that had made him the monster he had become. Naruto, Hinata said strongly even as her heart was shaking. I am not abandoning you, not now, not ever. Naruto's eyes narrowed, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. His power surged, warping the air itself as if it could tear apart the very fabric of reality. You should have stayed away, Hinata. You've seen what I've become. What I've done. It's too late to save me. You're wrong, whispered Hinata in a quiet tone but with incredible determination. There's good in you, still. I know it. Her words, though soft, rang out into the distorted land around him and, for a moment, stopped Naruto's forward motion. A flash of something human flashed across his face, but that too was over before it even started. He thrust out a hand, wave of shadow tearing through the air as the very earth beneath him buckled. You're wasting your time, Naruto growled, his power surging once again. I am the god of death now. There is no going back. But Hinata did not give up. With a swift motion, she activated the artifact, channeling all of its might. The air around them shivered with energy, and the shadows that had obeyed Naruto's will began to ride and recoil, as if they too feared what was about to happen. Naruto's body shook as the link to the Shinigami was cut. The world around him cracked open, the air filled with static as if time itself had lost its hold. In that instant, Naruto was no longer the Death King. He was a man, caught between two worlds, his power unstable, his form flickering. Hinata took advantage of the opening. With all her might, she channeled the energy from the artifact into a single strike. A bolt of pure light shot out from her and slammed into Naruto's chest, and its impact sent the shockwave that ran through the twisted realm. Naruto's form momentarily faltered, his power began to splinter, and in his eyes the eyes of the Shinigami glimmered the barest hint of panic. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. Sensing the gap, the allied forces charged ahead. The rest of the cage, broken but not shattered, made one last push toward the necropolis, putting all their remaining resources into battle. Chaos again erupted in the battlefield as the forces of life and death clashed once more. But even as the forces of the living rallied to strike back, Naruto's form started to set in again. The shadows, which had been pushed away, now surged back, and the warped realm around him started to remold itself. He was back in control, he had regained his power, and the air was electric with the dark energy of his rebirth. "You should have stayed away, Hinata." Naruto's voice was now a whisper, but it carried the weight of a god's decree. "I warned you." With a single motion, Naruto absorbed the power of the artifact into himself, and the energy surged through him, reinforcing his control over the Shinigami's domain. His power exploded outward, a wave of destruction that tore through the battlefield, sending shockwaves across the land. The forces of the allied shinobi had lost their chance. The moment had passed. Naruto stood as the god of death, his form unwavering, his power absolute. There was no hope left. No way to undo the damage. The world would bend to his will, and no one would ever challenge him again. Hinata stood there, in the middle of it all, only able to stand by and watch as the darkness closed in, the man she loved and had fought for slipping through her fingers once again. The world shook at the heels of Naruto's actions. A once thriving city, now in ruins, a kingdom ruled by the god of death, and yet even this dark throne was not immune to the consequences of his own unchecked power. The winds held with whispers of the spectral forces that had once obeyed him without question, now stirring with rebellion. His overuse of the Shinigami's power began to unravel him, body, mind, and soul, fracturing the very foundation of the world he had built. It was a subtle thing at first. A crack in the sky, a tremor in the earth beneath his feet, a faint murmur from the shadows that stretched across the land. But soon, the cracks spread like wildfire, destabilizing the entire necropolis. The once immovable walls of the dark fortress quivered, and the once dead streets, now teeming with spectral forces, began to falter under his control. The undead, his loyal army, began to lose their form, their once perfect movements turning erratic and wild. The shadows that had obeyed him so completely now seemed to resist, curling away from him as if the very essence of his connection to the Shinigami was disintegrating. The force once unified in their dark, death-filled existence, like the perfect unification of man and God, began to fray. The once march in cohesion broke loose into chaos, a contagion sweeping across the necropolis. The very streets that never held a whispered voice now served as battlegrounds. The things that Naruto once summoned to reinforce his rule would turn against him. Naruto stood in the center of it all, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. His eyes burned with the intensity of the Shinigami's power, but beneath that, something else stirred an unsettling discomfort. The whispers of his past, of the boy he had once been, echoed faintly in his mind, like ghosts trying to claw their way to the surface. Memories he had long buried began to resurface, memories of loneliness, of rejection, of a world that had never understood him. As the rebellion of his forces raged around him, Naruto gritted his teeth, trying to drown out the rising tide of doubt. But it was no use. The flood of memories was too strong. He saw himself again, a child of the village that had rejected him, cast him aside for the more acceptable members of society. He remembered the pain of his isolation, the ache of being treated as a monster instead of a person. He recalled how many nights he had spent all alone, going over and over to look for meaning, purpose, wanting the world to love him despite its turning its back on him. Memory swirled around him like a storm, clashing with the might of the Shinigami flowing through him. The contrast was overpowering. The dark power the Shinigami promised was to be eternal, the destruction of everything, above mortality, transcending it, but beneath it lay a gnawing emptiness, a great loneliness that nothing godly could heal. Wasn't this a path he wanted? Hadn't he transformed into something incapable of redemption anymore, or remained a spark, a flicker of the little boy he was once, for someone to learn, to care, to become part of? As visions of his past tore through his mind, Naruto's resolve began to crack. The power of the Shinigami surged violently in response to his inner turmoil, and in response, the necropolis itself seemed to bend and twist with him. Shadows that once worshipped him now writhed in defiance. The air around him felt heavy, thick with the tension of a world on the brink of collapse. Then comes the final blow. The Allied forces, which saw the weak point within Naruto, understood that the moment they had been waiting for had arrived. Thus, they launched a full-scale attack against the necropolis, shattering the already weakened defenses with a newfound fervor. The Kage, battered but unwavering, led their forces into the heart of darkness, hoping to get to the heart of Naruto's power. Their combined might, strengthened by the forbidden techniques and seals meant to counteract the necromantic forces, was now surging toward the throne room. The wave of their approach washed over Naruto, the change in the balance of power. Fighting back, stamping out this rebellion with the force of his will, was something that stirred something within him. He could still fight, still crush them underfoot, but the weight of it all, the years of pain, the sacrifices, the destruction had begun to take its toll. His body, weakened from his overuse of the Shinigami's power, trembled under the strain. His once immense power, the force of his divine control over life and death, was no longer enough to stave off the growing instability. But still, he fought. The fury and desperation welled in Naruto's eyes as he reached up to call out the shadows. Reality seemed to bend itself to his whim as he unleashed the undead army upon the battlefield. His undead, though weak, moved forward one final time as a mob of warped beings, wanting desperately to defend their king. Beasts from the spectral plane began to coalesce into forms monstrous and fearsome, twisted combinations of chakra and death. They let out a simultaneous roar as they charged forward into the opposing forces, claws and fangs sharpened to tear through the living. The Allied forces rushed head-on with the undead ranks that began crumbling under Naruto's monstrous creations. Jutsu clashed against jutsu and air charged electrically from every clash as they struck one against the other, cracking ground from under their soles and crevices extending outward, breaking through, since Earth was a witness to not bearing this cataclysm's weight. Naruto's body shuddered as he forced the power of the Shinigami to its very limits. His hands trembled, his vision began to blur, but he couldn't and wouldn't back down. His will was unbreakable, wasn't it? He was a god. He had gone beyond the confines of humanity. This was his fate, his prerogative. No one would stop him. And yet, even as he fought, something inside him began to break. The memories of his past, the boy abandoned by the world, swelled forward, forcing entry into his mind. The boy who had craved acceptance, longed to be loved. But now, standing at the pinnacle of power, he realized in his quest for vengeance, in the hunger for recognition, he had lost everything that had mattered. He had become a god, but at what price was it? To rule over a world that feared him, that saw only a monster in him. Hinata's voice was like the echoes of his mind. Her words were just distant whispers, but they cut through the chaos like a blade. There's still good in you. I know it. Those words, those simple words, were like a wound reopening in his chest. She had believed in him, even when he had believed there was nothing left to save. She had seen him as a person, not a monster, not a god. She had cared for him when no one else had. The thought of her, of everything he had lost, shook him to his core. And in that moment of weakness, Naruto's resolve failed him. The shadows around him seemed to wait, as if they too were waiting for something. The power that had once surged uncontrollably through his veins now felt foreign, as if it was no longer his to command. He gazes at the battlefield before him, faces once lined up alongside his in the shinobi ranks, faces of those he had devastated into their graves. He could see clearly then that this was no longer for power or for vengeance. This was something deeper, unfathomable to be defeated by death or destruction. Too late. The tide of battle had already changed, and the forces of the living had gotten the better end. Naruto chose in a last-ditch decision. His body was breaking, and his power was straining it to the limits. His form blurred and became fragmented as he merged completely into the Shinigami, sacrificing whatever was left of his human form to become an eternal entity forever bound to the realm of death. The Shinigami's power surged through him, filling the void left behind by his physical self. He became a being of pure darkness, an unstoppable force that could not be contained. The world itself seemed to buckle beneath the weight of his final transformation. But even as Naruto entered his final form, he could not avoid the truth that had been following him all along. The shadows fell, and in their place, there was nothing but emptiness. He was a god, but he was alone. The battle that had once raged at the heart of the necropolis was over. Naruto's final act, his ascension into the Shinigami, had torn apart the very fabric of reality, leaving nothing but the ruins of a once proud kingdom. The necropolis, which had been a testament to his power, now lay in ruins, its towering spires and shadowed streets crumbling into the abyss. It was as if the land itself had died, consumed by the very power it had once been built to contain. The remaining forces of the allied forces, the survivors of this apocalyptic battle, rose out of the ruin. They were battered, broken, but they were alive. For them, the battle was over, but the price was steep. Many of their fellow comrades had lost their lives in the futile last-ditch effort to stop Naruto. The Kage could no longer serve as the great leaders they were meant to be. Instead, they were there to mourn over the loss of their people to a war they could not possibly win. The remaining villages started the work of rebuilding afterward. It spread all the way down from the center of Necropolis to the furthest reaches of the shinobi world. Villages that previously teemed with life were nothing more than ghost towns, their peoples lost to the terrors of war. Even those who survived were left tormented by the memories of the carnage that would not leave the faces of the ones they loved and lost. Not Hinata, whom more than everyone feared weighed the loss herself. She'd been one of the few persons who had found a way to escape the necropolis alive, but at an almost unbearable cost. Naruto, for whom she harbored love that for such a long period, she only knew as pain, was taken away from this world. As far as the soul was concerned, having finally transformed into Shinigami destroyed every shred of manhood left about him. Then, there would only be some godlike aspect, an unconscious force that took everything in his way. Despite all this mourning for the person he was, one part of her refused to really believe that that man was forever gone. She could still feel him, a faint presence lingering in the very air, as if the echoes of his humanity had not been entirely consumed by the power of the Shinigami. Days passed, and Hinata dedicated herself to the memory of Naruto, making pilgrimages to the ruins of the necropolis, standing at the side of the throne room where he once stood, a god of death. She prayed for him, hoping that somewhere, in the depths of the Shinigami's power, a fragment of Naruto's soul still lingered. Her belief in his humanity was unwavering. She had seen the flickers of doubt in his eyes before he had ascended, the cracks in his resolve when the weight of his past had caught up with him. She knew that somewhere inside the Shinigami was the Naruto she once knew, the boy who wanted acceptance, who wanted a better world. She could not let his legacy be defined by the monster he had become. The world didn't cheer her belief. To most, Naruto's reign had been a nightmare. It was the god who had risen from his ashes, created out of the ashes of his own destruction and brought the world to its knees. Stories of power were told in all the remaining villages, whispers of his shadow still over the land. Some claimed to have seen his silhouette on the horizon, others spoke of strange, dark forces that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. It was as if Naruto, even in his death, still exerted some kind of influence over the world. In the silent nights when the wind wailed through the remains of the necropolis, there were others who swore they could hear the echoes of his voice, faint whispers seeming to come from the shadows themselves. The air would grow cold, the ground tremble, and for a brief moment, the world would feel as though it had slipped into the grasp of a god. But there was no tangible proof, only the whispers and hearsay were believed to be. Some believed Naruto had truly transcended into God, that his reign as sovereign of the damned is far from over but had now surpassed the boundaries of mortality to a different stage of being. Others like Hinata hold onto the notion that a piece of him lies, buried within the power of Shinigami, waiting to be unearthed. A slow and gradual reconstruction was underway in the village of Konoha. The once proud village that had stood at the heart of the shinobi world as an example of strength was now nothing but a dim shadow of its former self. The villagers who had once cowered from Naruto's name, who had ostracized him, now had to deal with the repercussions of their own doing. They had seen him come to power, as he had assumed leadership over Konoha and the other villages, and they had sat back. And now, sitting in their own broken homes, they had no choice but to consider what had become of them. Tsunade was the last surviving Kage. She returned to her village, though her heart remained heavy with regret. The weight of her choices, the decisions that had led to this moment, pressed down on her like an unbearable burden. She had once been a healer, a protector of her people, but now she was only a reminder of the failure of the shinobi world. The Kage, once the protectors of their villages, had failed to protect their people from the very monster they had created. The survivors who had fought alongside Naruto found themselves questioning their beliefs. They had followed him into battle, had fought for him, and had seen firsthand the extent of his power. Now, as the world shifted and the dust of battle settled, they were left with the unsettling question of whether the power they had witnessed could ever be stopped. And meanwhile, there were those who continued believing that Naruto's legacy was not one of the destruction. Instead of all that hopelessness, they clung to the possibility of a future beyond the dark aura cast by his ruling era. The world could indeed rebuild upon the darkness that had blanketed it. For many, redemption was possible for the man who had been the most feared entity in the shinobi world. There was Hinata, who refused to give up on him. She continued her pilgrimage to the ruins of the necropolis, praying for a sign, for some indication that Naruto's soul still lingered, that there was a chance for redemption, even in the face of such overwhelming power. She knew the chances were dim, but still, she felt unable to stop hoping that, after all that had happened, the man to whom she was once devoted might still be capable of redemption in the eyes of God. Then one afternoon, she happened to be on the fringes of the necropolis with the heart almost shattering. All she heard then was the silence. Only after some minutes a low and hoarse sound emerged like an insignificant wind and started building on until the full strength became intelligible, the sound of the human voice and its one all-familiar intonation of this girl herself, Hinata. My breath got stolen. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the distance, she saw a figure standing in the shadow of the ruins. It was him, Naruto. But it couldn't be. He was gone. He had ascended to become the Shinigami. There was no way he could be here, standing before her. Yet, the figure stood there, shrouded in darkness, his form flickering like a shadow in the wind. It was as if he were caught between two worlds, unable to fully step into either. Hinata's heart raced as she took a tentative step forward, calling out his name. Naruto. The figure never replied, however, and an icy air rushed in around the girl. In fact, Even the earth crumbled at the soles of her feet. So much of presences was alive, as well as power, and to her knowledge of it was alien. She'd feel it through the curves, as if the plane reality warping it to this unknown figure far and away was shaping itself toward Will. Hinata. Hinata's hand shook as she stretched out toward the figure, but before she could take another step, the ground cracked open beneath her feet and she tumbled backward. The figure was gone. The moment was still, the howling wind quiet. No whispers now crept within shadows. However, deep inside Hinata knew something had been different. It had not yet come to the end with Naruto. Neither was the power nor influence eradicated by that. There in the dark somewhere, hidden away in this world, whispered in the shadows that there had existed a sovereign who reigned from the very afterlife of death. And as the lone traveler made his way toward the ruins of the necropolis, drawn by the whispers of power and shadow, the world held its breath, waiting for what would come next.